Hello, and welcome to the NotACast podcast, the one true chapter by chapter podcast going through A Song of Ice and Fire one chapter a week. I am one of your hosts, Jeff, better known as Brady Beefish.
And I'm your other host, Emmett, better known as Poor Quentin.
And welcome to the 65th episode of the NotACast entitled The End of the Beginning, an analysis of a Game of Thrones Arya 5 in which George R.R. Martin finally stops sticking around, pulls out our hearts, and then, God, steps on them? Why does he have to do that? Steps on them while we watch. Because, Emmett, I'm afraid this is the chapter where, no, it's not going to happen this time. Ned's going to make it. He's going to fly away in a flock of pigeons. He's going to be just fine, right? Right?
How did you ever get the reputation as a curmudgeon, Jeff? You're such a sweet summer child deep down. You know that?
Am I a sweet summer child? Am I? Oh my God, I can't believe that Ned's going to die this chapter. It happens every single time I read this book. Why does it always happen this way?
I know you just want to get that instant replay going and change everything, but I'm afraid we can't, Jeff. Obviously, this is one of the big moments in the series. It was one of the big moments on the show as well. It really needs no introduction. It's bigger than all of us, and we just hope we do it justice.
I certainly hope so too. And the reason why we want to do it as special justice this time around is because we have about 50 odd people or so who are watching us on our live stream of this episode. And thank you all very much. As you guys know, when we reached our $3,500 a month Patreon level, we opted to begin starting quarterly live streams. And if we reach our next stretch goal, which is coming up here hopefully somewhat soon, we'll start doing these monthly. So if you guys like what we're doing and like seeing our ugly mugs here and our very large foreheads going head to head to each other, then we get the you will get that opportunity provided we reach our next stretch goal on Patreon. So we really appreciate everyone doing that, and we appreciate everyone's contributions on Patreon for sure.
Yeah, absolutely, guys. We're always so impressed and flattered by your support. Whether you give to our Patreon or not, the fact that you're willing to show up and listen to us is more flattering than anything else. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. So as always, this episode is brought to you by our small council patrons on Patreon, our Hand of the King Wolfman Zach, Grand Maester Timothy W., Lord Commander of the Kingsguard Mark N., Lord Travis, Master of Ships and Ward of the Waves, Sir Keith J., Master of Whispers, Lord Philip the Merciful, Master of Laws, Jancy O., Lady Commander of the Night's Watch, Lord G., Master of Coin, Archmaester June, Healer of the Lesser Poxes, Ragged Michael, Ward of the North, Nelson the Hammer, Prince of Dragonscone, Scarlet the other Red Woman and Mistress of Whispers, Lord Baby the Onion Baby, Lord Blackheart the Defiant, Master of Zorse, Lord Micah, Warden of the West and the Kraken's Bane, Lord James, the Gem that was promised, the High Bearded Priest, the Blue-Ringed Octoling, Lord Jake, Assistant to the Hand of the King, and thank you, counselors, very, very much.
Thank you, counselors, as always. We also want to give credit to the artist who did the picture we had up on this page before we started recording. That's from the illustrated edition of Game of Thrones, and that was by Magali Villeneuve, who does a lot of great artwork of the series. And yeah, that was his artwork of Ned Stark getting executed, and that's just a wonderful piece. So all credit to him.
Absolutely. It is a great, great work. Although I actually think it is a woman who is Magali Villeneuve.
Oh, well, that's embarrassing.
Oh, it's okay. It's she's
My apologies.
No, it's all good. If you read The World of Ice and Fire, she does a number of the great artwork pieces there. And I believe she did this piece of art specifically from this particular episode is from the 2016 Illustrated Game of Thrones edition. So it's a really, really good version of the book if you guys want to pick it up. She does all the artwork for it, and I really enjoy her artwork. And she is a fan of A Song of Ice and Fire, which is really, really awesome.
For sure. One of the things I love best about the community is all the great artists. Our friend Sanrixian, aka Mallory, our friend Vanessa Cole does incredible portraits. So a lot of great artists in the community for sure.
Absolutely. So thank you. So thank you, Magali Villeneuve, for using your artwork. So we wanted to start quickly before we actually get into a question with a fun riddle from one of our sworn swords, Lady B-Word, who is in the chat on our YouTube channel, who is the Riddler of A Song of Ice and Fire. If you guys are not following her on Twitter, she is at B-Word, I want to say, maybe at B-Word85. I'm not sure which one it is. If you want to let folks know in the chat who you are specifically, that'd be awesome. So she has a riddle for everyone here. So she says, riddle. I kept it pretty easy for you guys. Thank you very much, because I suck at riddles. So she goes on. I am the link to both of your names. I forfeited all my claims. I fought with the fish. I saw the frog die. When my time is due, will anyone cry? So ponder and debate away, listeners and viewers, and we'll reveal the answer at the end of this podcast.
For sure, I always love a good riddle. You know, I was raised on The Hobbit, like any good young nerd, so I developed a love for riddles at an early age. That doesn't mean I'm any good at them. I think I might even be worse than Jeff.
Well, you can't be that much worse than me. I'm terrible at riddles.
I'll try my best.
Terrible.
Our question this week comes from one of our small council members, Master of Zorse, who asks, what is the behind-the-scenes moment you would most like to read about? Personally, I love to read the conversations that took place between Stannis, Melisandre, and Mance. Well, that is an excellent question. There's so much great scenes that happen off-screen in A Song of Ice and Fire that we just hear about afterwards, or just suggested and implied. So how would you answer that question, Jeff?
Well, I've said this often and many, many times before, but I'll say it again. I think one of the behind the scenes moments I would love to have read in a point of view chapter, and it wasn't possible given the point of view roster that George R. R. Martin has for A Dance with Dragons, but the conversation between Stannis and the Mountain Clansmen, where you have this taciturn, angry, irritated king who's up there, who Jon tells Stannis, like, you have to go there, you have to praise the beauty of their women, praise how awesome their food is, smoke pipes with them, drink beer with them. And you just imagine Stannis there as this guy who literally flavors his water with salt and lemon, having to go hang out with all of these crazy, basically wildlings who are living under Winterfell, ostensibly, but are still maintaining a culture of a lot of freedom and a lot of autonomy, and have Stannis there hanging out with these guys, this kind of cold, very moral, very rigid guy up there hanging out with these guys. But somehow Stannis was able to win these guys to his side. And I've always wondered, like, how he was able to actually do that. Were they just impressed with his military acumen? Were they thinking like, oh, wow, this guy, well, I guess we don't really have any alternative given the fact that we have to rescue, or at that time they didn't know that Arya was captured, but given the fact that we have the Boltons and the Freys we have to take on and take out because they were part of the Red Wedding and they killed many of our kinsmen at the Red Wedding themselves. So what was the actual motivation to get the Klansmen on their side? Now, we do know that after they took Deepwood Mott, that the Klansmen started clamoring for Stannis to march on Winterfell. But as far as we know, Stannis and the Klansmen did not know that Arya was at Winterfell until after that event in A Dance with Dragons. So that was after the Wayward Bride, after Ash's first chapter, that is the Wayward Bride from A Dance with Dragons. That's when they actually knew that. So what was the actual impetus for them to actually back Stannis, to bring their swords and spears and their flinty, like, stone axes? That's one of the things they talk about too, onto Stannis' side in order to fight the Ironborn and then eventually march onto Winterfell. So what was that conversation actually like? I would love that behind the scenes moment from A Dance with Dragons. I know we're not going to get it, but I still really, really want it.
You stole mine, Jeff, and that is such a perfect event in every possible way. We had a guilty Undertaker in the chat who just says, the Mountain Clan's toast got Stannis drunk, which I could definitely see. But as you say, it's so fascinating to imagine Stannis sitting there with, like, his eye twitching and his arms crossed as they like you know, they play their pipes and do their, like, feats of strength the way Jon said they would, and said Stannis would have to accept it. And he's just very begrudgingly listening to that. And yeah, it's a good question why they bothered to march with him, especially since they don't seem to have bent the knee to him and don't really seem to have any long-term plans to stick with Stannis once they got a Stark back in Winterfell. I got to imagine it was a enemy of my enemy as a friend sort of thing when it came to fighting the Ironborn. Stannis offered that. But while he's not temperamentally like the wildlings, Mountain Clans, revealing, as you said, they're very similar. Well, he's not temperamentally like the Mountain Clans in terms of them being kind of like rough and rowdy and up for a drink and up for a big roaring speech. They are like Stannis in terms of being very militant and not being very materialistic. Like, they're the exact opposite of the Southron lords that flocked around Renly and then Stannis Storm's End. People like Alistair Florin, who he really didn't seem to care for very much. The Mountain Clans aren't like that. And it ties into something I really like with Stannis in both Storm and Dance, which is that he feels like he temperamentally belongs more in the north than the south in some ways. Like, he kind of makes more sense surrounded by the wall and, like, everyone in black cloaks and just grimness everywhere. He makes more sense there than he ever would in, like, The Reach or even King's Landing. So that's a great choice. I think the Master of Zorse's example is another great one. Stannis, Melisandre, and Mance having those conversations at the end of Storm and the beginning of Dance, because much as we both love Stannis, I think there's one character in the series I really love politically. It's actually more Mance, and I think he's a great character in and of himself. I would love to see their conversations. And then to throw a more original one in the ring, just to stick with the Stannis theme, I would love to actually have a scene between Stannis and Melisandre at length, which we really haven't had in the books. And I understand why. Again, no POV until Melisandre becomes one in Dance, at which point Stannis has left the wall. And, George wants to keep that relationship kind of mysterious and just kind of hint and allude to it. And I get why that is. And I think and hope that, if and when we get the Winds of Winter, Melisandre's supposed to have a lot more chapters. She'll presumably link back up with Stannis at some point. That's when I think we'll see that relationship. But it is interesting, and I would love to have seen how Melisandre first got under Stannis' skin, so to speak. Because, she had to win his trust and intimacy in a way that few have. And unlike a lot of, witch sorceress characters, she didn't directly possess or bewitch him right off the bat. She convinced him and persuaded him and seduced him. So that's something I would like to see, and I hope we do get to see one-on-ones between them in the Winds of Winter.
Yeah, I agree there. And the really cool thing about that is that we do know that in the Winds of Winter, George has said that there will be multiple Melisandre chapters. We did talk about that in our analysis of Daenerys 8. So I imagine that is going to be some of the backstory that Melisandre will explore. In the specific context that George was talking about, he was saying that he's going to explore Ahai not necessarily as a place that we are going to see as it is right now, but we're going to see it in the dreams and memory of Melisandre. But I do imagine, too, that we're going to be seeing a bit of kind of the background, what brought Melisandre to Stannis, because that's always been a mystery, right? We know that Melisandre sees Stannis as Azor Ahai reborn and sees him as the prophesied hero of history and of legend, and that's really, really cool, right? That's a big part of who Melisandre is that she is a true believer. And there was such a cool thing in A Dance with Dragons because so many people apparently, and I wasn't a part of the fandom before 2011 when Game of Thrones aired, but I do strongly, I remember, oh, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say peasant.
I know, right? You were the OG in terms of that because you were there. You were reading the books back in like 2005, right?
Yeah, my mom gave them to me. I was just reading the books all on my own years before there ever was a show. And that does make me better than all of you. Carry on, Jeff.
I can't believe that. I was just talking to my mom tonight about letting her borrow my first season of Game of Thrones, but I couldn't find it in my library. My extensive mahogany, leather-bound books in my library, and my season 1 and season 2 DVDs of Game of Thrones because she has a DVD player. We don't have a Blu-ray over this way because we're not.
That's adorable.
Like that. But no, it's really, really cool because I would love to see kind of like what more was the evidence that Melisandre was seeing before she actually came to Dragonstone. And I've had this theory, if you want to call it that what Melisandre was seeing in her visions and dreams was a version of Jon Snow as Azor Ahai reborn because he is, Rhaegar's son. Rhaegar would have been potentially the king after Aerys II, and the prince. And I have to imagine too, maybe Melisandre didn't actually see Stannis, but she was like, oh well, Azor Ahai reborn is going to be born on Dragonstone. He's going to be on Dragonstone. So she shows up to Dragonstone, and all of a sudden there's Stannis Baratheon there proclaiming himself the king, and she's like, now I can put 2 and 2 together. Stannis is on Dragonstone. The Azor Ahai reborn is supposed to be on Dragonstone when in fact she should be seeing Jon Snow. But of course, prophecy is a fickle bitch, as we all like to say in the Song of Ice and Fire and in this fan community.
That's a direct quote from the series, I think. And yeah, I think she might have been misinterpreting it as Jon. Obviously, we see that happen in Dance when she asked to see Azor Ahai and R'hllor shows her only capital S Snow. But maybe she saw something that actually refers to Dany. If she was seeing visions of Dragonstone, well, Dany was born there. So maybe that's what that was referring to. So I think this gets into kind of the ambiguity surrounding who exactly is Azor Ahai and people reflecting more aspects of him than embodying him as one person. Like, Melisandre thinks, there's just one Azor Ahai. It's just math, 1-to-1. And everything in the series that we see with Azor Ahai imagery and just the philosophy surrounding magic and prophecy in general suggests that she's wrong about that.
True that, yeah. Melisandre is a true believer, but she always, always, always misinterprets her visions. And I think that's a great turn that George has, is that the prophet can see everything, but she can't interpret it correctly. It's such a wonderful turn on George's part to make that prophet character just all knowing, but not all. I'm trying to make this sound intelligent. All seeing, yet not all knowing. Bam, nailed it.
Perfect, Jeff. Yeah, I can't wait to get to Melisandre's character in Clash of Kings, as well as Stannis and Davos. Of course, George has called her the most misunderstood character in the series. I think he's right, and we're going to be making that case before too long.
Absolutely. Do you want to take a few questions from the fandom before we push on to the synopsis, or should we?
Sure, guys. If you want to throw a couple questions into the chat, by all means do so.
Yeah, I did see that someone in the chat was talking about how they were also saying that they wanted to see, I think it was Tony, and I forget the numbers afterwards, was saying similar to you that he wanted to see Stannis and Melisandre as that their meeting and what brought Melisandre there. So I think that was cool that, he said that first, and then you were there like being like, yes, that's absolutely what I want to see. Look at you. You were the avatar. You were the embodiment of the fandom right now.
I am Bran Stark. I'm always a little ahead of the game.
Mm-hmm.
see if we have anything else. Oh, Lewis Robertson says, I wish my mom was as supportive of my Squawk love as Emmett's is. True. My mom is pretty perfect. Oh, okay.
Yeah, we saw pictures of your mom recently, right?
That's true, and everyone was hitting on her. Don't do that, guys. Sammy JB117 asks, if y'all had to choose another character from a SWAF to adopt as a namesake, who would you choose? Can't both choose Stannis. I mean, Mance Raider is kind of an awesome name. I mean, it literally means home invader, but it's still pretty badass. I love that, like, Mance clearly was insecure when he went back to the wildlings about being a crow. So he was like, how can I possibly assuage these people? I know, I'll call myself Raider. And then someone, it's a little on the nose, Mance. He said, I'll change the I to a Y. It'll be fine. And then the other person said, but they sound the same and we're illiterate. And Mance was like, I'm Mance Raider now.
Not important. Interesting question from Luke Wood, who asked, which character would you like to see added as a point of view? Well, I have one that I think would be really, really cool, and I'm curious why George has not opted for this. I think it's interesting. I would love to see. A lot of people say, like, "Oh, I want Stannis, or I want Littlefinger, I want Varys." Like, no, I don't want those characters as point of view characters because they need to be kind of shrouded in mystery and ambiguity. I really would love to see Roderick the Reader adopted as a point of view character for the burning of Old Town, because oh my God, wouldn't that be awesome to see him there watching the Citadel library burn to the ground? Like, how wretched that's going to be and stomach turning to see a guy who is known as the Reader watching all of human history melt away in Euron's fires, Eldritch fires, if you want to go with that, with what I'm assuming would be what you would go for. So I like that idea. I know that some people have talked about, like, some of the Tyrell boys, either Garland or Willis, they would be cool as well. But I think Roderick the Reader would be an awesome point of view character.
Can't go wrong there. I'm always for more perspectives on Euron's Eldritch Fire. I think I would, if I could go back retroactively and make Marjorie a POV, starting with book 2. I think that would be really interesting because we don't have a POV among the Tyrells. We don't really have a POV in Renly's camp, like in Sconce. We have Catelyn who goes there and shows us Renly's camp, but no one from that camp. I think her perspective in Storm could be interesting, depending on what she knows about the Purple Wedding, depending on how she feels about Sansa. I think that could be an interesting dynamic to get into. And then in Feast, I would love, like, dueling Cersei and Marjorie chapters, like the young queen trying to be responsible. And I like the hints that she's trying to kind of coach Tommen to be better and get her away from Cersei. I'd like to see more of that. I understand why George didn't make the Tyrells POVs. They know too much about the Purple Wedding in advance. And it's kind of interesting to have this, like, the perfect image politics house. You shouldn't get a POV from them, right? Because George is trying to say some stuff about how the Tyrells look from the outside, and you got to dig their way in. But I think Marjorie could provide some useful scenes. Like, I really love the Renly Marjorie scene in the tent in season 2. That added scene, I think that's really interesting.
Yes.
So I would have loved to see some kind of version of that.
That would be really, really cool. I think Marjorie is such an interesting character because I feel like, as a character, for me, she is so much tied up in Natalie Dormer, who, again, for those of you guys who don't know that by now, I didn't start reading the books until after season 2, and it was introduced to Marjorie Tyrell in the form of Natalie Dormer, who's an excellent actor. So having her as a 16-year-old, as she is in the books, as a point of view character, contrasting against Cersei, would be really fascinating. I know one of the reasons that George had talked about why he was really pushing until for like 5 years essentially to have Feast and Dance as one book is that he planned to be intercutting Cersei with Daenerys chapters to kind of be showing rule and how people rule. But I do like that idea of having Marjorie being that, like, actually more objective viewpoint in King's Landing. Like, wait a minute, Cersei is actually really fucking crazy, and we should, and we readers kind of get that impression too. But having someone also there be like, yeah, this is not for the best. Let's go with something else, and then having her watch Cersei fall from grace, and watching as well Cersei put her in harm's way would be an excellent touch on George's part.
I do love this aspect in Feast where everyone, like, the Tyrells, are just kind of shocked at how bad Cersei is at this. Like, they didn't, like, you can see them reaching out going, no, like, we're not your enemies. We're trying to run an alliance with you.
Right.
Why are you behaving this way? And having that POV on could be interesting. To take just at least one more from Lady B Word, who asks, what role would Stannis have in high school? Always like I often see, like, the Stannis Renly contrast is like, oh, one's a jock and one's like a theater kid. And I think that misunderstands the relationship. Stannis and Renly are both theater kids, just very, very different kinds. Renly is Rent. Stannis is Phantom. Renly is like a popular theater kid who has a group of friends. Stannis is like wants the spotlight for his solo, like, brooding song while everyone just watches. as Tyrion says about Stannis and Renly, they're too different yet too alike to ever get along. So I think one of the interesting things about their relationship is that really Stannis is not like an emotionless automaton. He's a diva like Renly, just in a completely different style and way. If he was really like, a heartless tin man, he would be fine playing second fiddle to Renly. It's because they both want to be divas that they can never share a room and never share a space. So I do like I do like high school AUs, I think, with these characters, because you kind of get at the childish relationships you get with characters like Stannis and Renly, where they're both technically adults, but that Catelyn chapter at Storm's End is like, that's why you have Catelyn's POV is so perfect as a mom, because they're both such infants in that scene. So imagining them squabbling over the lunch table, the Baratheons, especially with Robert, is kind of like the aged jock character. I can just imagine the Baratheons in high school so perfectly.
Well, see, you were like into theater in high school, but I was more into sports when I was in high school. So I imagine like Renly being like kind of, the star running back. Robert was the quarterback, and Stannis was like the offensive lineman that like nobody really cares about. Got signed to a really shitty contract, like in the NFL, played for like 3 seasons before being hurt permanently, and walks around with a limp these days. But Renly, of course, he's the fast, running back who ends up getting into a lot of legal trouble later on because he's not the rightful king and he sucks. But of course, Robert, of course, being the quarterback there, kind of like oh my gosh, he's the Joe Flacco or the Lamar Jackson of the Baratheon brothers. Renly, of course, is the Ray Rice of the Baratheon brothers, and Stannis is I don't know, Haloti Nada. He's a defensive end. Yeah, so I think that's the way I'm going to go for here.
Yeah, that's a great metaphor. I can just see Stannis saying, "Yeah, sure, Robert scored all those touchdowns, but what do you have if I wasn't stopping him from being sacked constantly? No." And now Renly's going to come in and get the contract. So yeah, I could see that for sure.
Absolutely. So thank you guys in the chat for the questions. We will, after we're done doing this episode itself, we will be happy to stick around for a while and chat with you guys. We love all the all of the interesting discussion we have there. We've got a lot of great people there. We've got Mary, we've got Joe, the Wrong Magician, we've got Girls Gone Canon, we've got Mark, we've got RJ Morrison, we've got a Song of Ice and Fire reread there too. So I think that's it's great, and so many great people there. So happy to see so many people out there with us. As you guys know, when we do end up recording these episodes, we do cut out a lot of this stuff and just make it more YouTube only. So you guys here who are getting this kind of the experience, you get to hear all of our fuck ups and stuff like that before we actually like do this thing, before we clean it up all nice and pretty for everyone like that. I think that's going to be a lot of fun. So thank you guys very much for joining us today.
For sure, we'll clean up super nice, but it's good to have our friends here for the flubs and all. Makes me feel good. Yes,
and it should make you feel good, because this chapter, I'm afraid, Emmett, is a little bit of a downer. I know, crazy enough as it is, the Ned Stark gets executed chapter is not necessarily a happy chapter, but here we are. What can we say?
But Jeff, Ned Stark is just dumb, so we shouldn't care that he dies. That's the point, according to hot takes of people who skimmed the books once.
Skimmed the books once or watched a TV show once, and yes, they drink and they know things too, I'm assuming too. So yes, all sorts of great, wonderful, fantastic things that are absolutely not true. So this is Arya's 5th chapter in A Game of Thrones. It's an interesting chapter because it's well, everybody remembers the second half, as Emma's going to talk about here, but nobody remembers the first half. But there's like 2/3 of this chapter has nothing to do with Ned Stark's execution, as we're going to be finding out here momentarily. So here is the synopsis for A Game of Thrones, Arya 5. The smell of evil drifts along the street of flour. It's calorie-heavy, carbohydrate-soaked bread. Yuck. And Arya Stark takes a deep-ass whiff of this hot bread and thinks, very wrongly I should add, that it's a sweeter smell than perfume. Through the smell of death and calories, Arya stalks her prey, a fat pigeon. And a fat pigeon is an idiot bird, I have to say that up front, eating a stale crust of bread. Arya's stick sword whirls out, crushing the bird's feet, and then the not a lady of House Stark grabs the bird and twists its neck until the bone snaps. The bird breaking its legs and then getting its neck snapped. Gosh, that just seems so foreshadowing and not at all ominous, right? I mean, it's so weird that this would be the thing that would start this chapter, right, Emmett?
Yes, but on the other hand, screw pigeons.
Yeah, fuck pigeons. They're
worst. Rats with wings. I find it difficult to feel sorry for them. Carry on.
I agree there. Look at us agreeing on something. It's something that we never get here on the NotACast. A passing septon looks on Arya with a look that I'm sure George R. R. Martin was personally familiar with in his youth in the Catholic Church, and that look is reproachful. And Arya, matter of fact, tells the Septon that this is the best place to find pigeons. Father looks askance, hurries away, and Arya ties the pigeon to her belt. As Arya moves down the street, she encounters a man and his food truck. He's selling fruit tarts from it, blueberries, lemons, and apricots. Yum. And that makes Arya hungry. She asks if she can have a sample, but no samples today. 3 coppers, the man says. Arya doesn't have coppers, but she does have a pigeon. And believing that King's Landing is a Habesian state of nature and could operate on a barter system, Arya attempts to exchange her pigeon for one of those tarts. But no, King's Landing is not quite Habesian yet. The others take your pigeon, the man says. Arya looks at the warm tarts, considers pinching one, but then Sirio's voice comes whispering back into her head. She sees the cart man with her eyes, thinking that he's left-legged and that she could make off with one of those tasty cakes from his cart before he'd know better. But then the man stops her cold. You be keeping your filthy hands off. The gold cloaks know how to deal with thieving little gutter rats, that they do. Well, Arya ain't about having an encounter with the gold cloaks. 2 of them are nearby, and she decides to back away to avoid any encounters with the robbery homicide squad of the Gold Cloaks. The very sight of the cops makes her queasy. Gosh, Emmett, so much for the tolerant left, getting all queasy around cops and shit like that.
I don't know what you're talking about, Jeff. I love America's defenders and first responders.
Thin blue line, baby, thin blue line. And now everyone in the chat is hating me. All right, onwards and upwards. Though Arya hadn't approached the Red Keep since she left it, she'd seen the heads mounted on spikes on the red walls and the crows flying around them thick as flies. And she knew from the flea bottom rumor mill that the Gold Cloaks had thrown him with the Lannisters, with Janos Slynt, that frog-faced motherfucker, having been raised to lordship in exchange for his service. It's not service, it's fucking treachery. Either or, depending on your wrong perspective. And there were other rumors too, like Ned had killed Robert. Renly had killed Ned. Renly had killed Robert and then fled like a terrorist to escape justice for his crimes. Another really, really wild story had it that Robert had been killed by a boar. Or maybe he had died eating the boar? No. Varys poisoned Robert. No, god damn it. Cersei had poisoned Robert. He got the herb and died from that. He choked on a bone. A fish bone, guys. Jeez, get your sewer minds right with the Lord. Ultimately, though, the one thing that all the stories concurred on was that Robert was dead. The bells from the great Septa Baelor had rung all through the day and night with, and I really, really love this imagery, the thunder of their grief rolling across the city in a bronze tide. God, George can really, really write, as if you guys didn't know. But Arya doesn't really have any skin in the game about whether Robert is dead or not, or who actually killed him. She just wants to go home, but that's easier said than done. The cops were everywhere, and she'd visited each of the King's Landing gates daily, but she had found that 3 of the gates were barred, while the Mud and God's gates were only open to incoming civilian traffic. In fact, there was really only one gate open to people trying to get the fuck out of the city, the King's Gate. But that was no sure thing. Lannister Redcloaks were searching wagons, and everyone going out of the gate. She might be caught if she tried going out that way. So she tried to think of other options. There was the option of potentially swimming across the Blackwater, but that would likely prove fatal due to the fast currents on the river. She could pay someone to take her across, provided she had money, of course, which she doesn't. And this had caused Arya to begin forgetting why her father, Ned, had warned her not to steal. Sooner or later, she would have to get the fuck out of King's Landing and risk the Gold Cloaks. Because beyond simply the danger of being captured by the Gold Cloaks, the greater danger was becoming hunger. At first, she'd eaten several pigeons raw, and she feared that she was growing sick from doing that. And while sure, there were pot shops in the alleys in Fleet Bottom where massive tubs of stew had been brewing for years, and she could trade half a pigeon to the pot shop owners for a heel of stale bread and a, quote, bowl of brown. Tasty, tasty. Even getting the other half of her bird put into the fire, the problem was that the shops weren't empty. People had eyes, and those eyes, well, they stared at Arya. Arya didn't know what they were thinking, but she did notice them looking at her cloak and boots, kind of that Stark clothing that Arya of House Stark, one of the most powerful houses of Westeros, had taken from the Red Keep before she had left. She'd even been followed a few times into the alleys and even chased once or twice, but no one had caught her yet. But that hadn't meant that she'd gotten off scot-free. She'd been robbed of her silver bracelet and bundle of clothes the first night. She'd only been able to maintain her cloak and her sword needle since she was using the cloak as a blanket and had been sleeping on top of her sword needle. Arya had turned to Arya then had turned to having the cloak over the right side of her body to conceal Needle and had moved about King's Landing holding a stick sword to ward off those who might mean her harm or mean to rob her. But she knew some of these jabronis in Flea Bottom wouldn't have been scared off even if she wielded a battle axe. So she'd been avoiding Flea Bottom as late. And as a consequence, often as not, she went to bed hungry rather than risk the stairs. Arya fantasizes about what it'll be like outside of King's Landing, why she'd pick berries, scavenge berries, fruits and roots. Hell, she might even chase down rabbits. There weren't any rabbits in King's Landing, only dogs and rats. And while the pot shops would pay a fistful of coppers for a litter of puppies, wow, yikes, Arya is not about to go all Astapori on herself. We flash back to the present with Arya moving down the maze of alleys and cross streets below the Street of Flower. A press of people crushes their way through, and Arya navigates using the middle of the street, a trick that she had learned early on. A gaggle of small children runs past Arya, chasing a rolling hula hoop. Arya envies the children their games and innocence, and Arya thinks back to the time when she played hoops with Bran, Jon, and Rickon. Oh, she wonders how big Rickon is now, or whether Bran is sad. But more than anything, she misses Jon, and wishes he was there to muss her hair and call her little sister. Everybody shed a tear. Okay, get your emotions back in line. Here we go. She had once tried talking to the kids in King's Landing, trying to make friends, but the small ones had run away in fear while the big kids asked questions that she couldn't answer. And one of those goddamn brats had even tried knocking her down to take her boots. Only the swift whirl of Arya's stick sword against the child's ear had prevented her from being robbed of her footwear. Yikes. Arya sees a seagull too high above her head to try and take it down, but it does make her think of the sea. Hey, now the sea. Maybe that's the way out of this dump of a town, Arya sort of thinks. She decides to make her way down to the wharf to see if there's passage out as a stowaway. Old Nan had told tales of boys and girls stowing away aboard ships. She could do the same. When Arya arrives, she finds the wharf quiet. Too quiet. She sees a pair of gold cloaks on patrol side by side, but they don't look at her. And the dock itself is weirdly only half full. And guys, that's because Stannis appropriated the fleet. It's the goddamn royal fleet after all, and he is the king. Shut the fuck up, Joe Magician. So Arya glumly thinks that the sea might not be the way out until she sees guardsmen in gray woolen cloaks trimmed with white satin. The sight of Winterfell's colors brought tears to Arya's eyes. Behind them, a sleek three-bank trading galley rocked at her moorings. Arya asks what ship this is, and a longshoreman tells her, well, it's the Windswitch out of Myr. Arya is overjoyed. That's the same ship her father hired to take Arya and Sansa back home in Eddard 14. Hooray! All's right with the world. She's about to sail back to Winterfell, right, guys? Right? She starts to approach this non-trap ship and sees two guardsmen dicing and one on patrol. Arya realizes she's crying and starts to rub the tears from her eyes, and this causes a very interesting reaction. Her eyes. Her eyes. Her eyes. Why did... Look with your eyes, she heard Cyril whisper. Arya looks with her eyes. She'd known every one of Ned's men, but these three were strangers. The one patrolling catches sight of Arya. You! What do you want here, boy? This causes the other two guardsmen to look up from their dice. Arya swallows hard. She knows that if she runs, they chase her, and they might catch her. So instead, she steps forward, not away from the guardsmen. And as she does, she realizes that they think her a boy. Well, by gumbo, she'd be a boy then. Want to buy a pigeon? The guardsmen tell her to get out, and Arya scurries away, not pretending to be frightened because she's absolutely fucking terrified. When she comes to after running, she finds herself back in Flea Bottom. Arya knew this part of King's Landing by the smell of the pots of brown alone, and she's still hungry. But sadly, so sadly, Arya realizes that the pigeon she had kept with her all day is gone. She wanted to cry and knows that she'll need to head back down to the Street of Flower to find another pigeon as large as the one she'd be carrying all day. But then the bells ring. Bum, bum, bum. Arya looks up and hears their distant thunder. Others peer out too. Small folk clatter about, wondering if Joffrey is dead. Nope, not yet. Storm of Swords, wait for that. Instead, it's a summoning bell. Everyone needs to gather at one particular spot. Arya sees two boys running in one direction and calls after them. What's happening? The gold cloaks is carrying him to the sept. Who? The Hand. They'll be taking his head off. Arya is running, but she doesn't know it. She trips over a rut left in the road by a wagon, and she falls to the ground, her knee and hand a bloody mess. The Redwine twins pass by her then. Arya remembers that Sansa and Jane Poole used to call them Sir Horror and Sir Slobber, which is great. And while her sister had giggled then, Arya ain't laughing now. Everyone moves towards the direction of the bell. Arya's finger hurts. She tore off her thumbnail when she had fallen. Big fucking ouch there. She bites, not chews her lip this time, limping towards the sounds ahead. She hears the voices of the people of King's Landing all around her talking about how the hand has been carried and maybe they should start betting over whether he gets beheaded or not. Then we get some more debate on what exactly happened to Robert with more rumors tossed about. It's good, clean, Christian fun. Yay. Arya reaches the Street of Sisters and finds a wall of people there. She lets the crowd push her forward as everyone gets closer and closer to none other than Baelor Sept. But the crush of people is too great. She can't see anything. She spies a cart and thinks to mount it, but she decides otherwise after watching an angry teamster whipping people away from mounting the cart. Finally, she's pushed to the front of the crowd and she comes up to stone. She looks up and Baelor's statue is there in front of her. She climbs the statue, wedging herself between King Baelor Targaryen's legs. That was when she saw her father. Ned stands on the pulpit with 2 gold cloaks between him. He's dressed nicely, though, with his gray and white wool cloak, but Ned was thin now, more skinny than she'd ever seen him. And he was in pain. His face was practically painted with anguish. And it wasn't like he was truly standing either. The gold cloaks were essentially holding him up. And behind Ned was the High Septon, the highest officer in the Faith of the Seven, old, gray, fat, wearing white robes and an enormous pope hat made of spun gold and a crystal that shattered light into rainbows whenever he moved about. But there were more than just those people there. Joffrey was there too with his knights and high lords. Cersei was there in mock mourning clothing. Oh, and there was Sandor Clegane too, with 4 other Kingsguard knights. Yes, Sandor Clegane is wearing his white cloak there. And Varys, he's there too. Oh, and then some strange short dude with a pointed triangle dick beard who had fought for Catelyn's hand in marriage. Yep, MF and Littlefinger's there too. Gosh, Emmett, why is he there? Just so much about why Littlefinger might be there at this event.
Oh yeah, we'll get into that, believe you me. We'll get into Littlefinger's presence towards the end of the eepisode.
I cannot fucking wait for that. But then Arya spies Sansa there too, and she scowls at her sister for standing up there smiling. Like, why are you smiling? What the fuck does Sansa have to be happy about? A line of riot cops holds back the small folk from getting too close to Baelor Sept. They're ready to deploy MRAPs, SWAT, and military-style rifles if the small folk get too uppity. Gods only help the small folk if they start calling for systemic political and social reform. Whew. Bad times are about to start happening in King's Landing if that happens. And finally, the bell stops tolling. And Ned begins to speak. And the people respond with their usual response. What? Louder! Louder! Louder from the front! Arya feels of righteous indignation. You leave him alone, she wants to shout. But she knows no one will hear and no one will listen. But then Ned lifts his head and look. Summarization is fine. I mean, I enjoy doing these things, but this deserves the full reading. So bear with me because this is kind of a longer passage in this chapter. And this is Ned's confession. I am Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Hand of the King. And I come before you to confess my treason and the sight of gods and men. No, Arya whimpered. Below her, the crowd began to scream and shout. Taunts and obscenities filled the air. Sansa had hidden her face in her hands. Her father raised his voice still higher, straining to be heard. I betrayed the faith of my king and the trust of my friend Robert, he shouted. I swore to defend and protect his children. Yet before his blood was cold, I plotted to depose and murder his son and seize the throne for myself. Let the High Septon and Baelor the Beloved and the 7 bear witness to the truth of what I say. Joffrey Baratheon is the one true heir to the Iron Throne, and by the grace of all the gods, Lord of the 7 kingdoms and protector of the realm. Just devastating, man, utterly devastating. And yet, there's a fun little turn of phrase in what Ned is in Ned's proclamation. Did you guys in the chat catch it? We'll talk about it in a bit if you didn't. A stone comes hurling from the crowd as Ned gets hit in the face to Arya's dismay. The gold cloaks hold Ned up while 2 Kingsguard knights step in front of Cersei and Joffrey to be their personal meat shields. Arya's hand goes to needle and it grips around the leather. She prays, please, please, gods, keep him safe. Don't let them hurt my father. The High Septon steps forward and somehow kneels in front of Joffrey. I like to think he kind of flops instead of kneels in front of Joffrey because, just... You see the kind of the image, the way that George has painted this guy, like it's pretty ridiculous the way this guy looks. And it's also funny imagining this guy flop in front of Joffrey. As we sin, so do we suffer. This man has confessed his crimes in the sight of gods and men here in this holy place. The gods are just, Yet Baelor the Blessed taught us that they are also merciful. What shall be done with this traitor, your grace? Barabbas, the crowd screams. Give us Barabbas! Ah, wait, that's the wrong story. But I mean, kind of different, but similar at the same time. And then Prince Joffrey, no, King Joffrey, Arya thinks, steps forward. And you bitches know I need to read this one. My mother bids me let Lord Eddard take the black, and Lady Sansa has begged mercy for her father. Joffrey looked straight at Sansa then and smiled. And for a moment, Arya thought that the gods had heard her prayer, until Joffrey turned to the crowd and said, but they have the soft hearts of women. So long as I am your king, treason shall not go unpunished. Sir Ilyn, bring me his head. The crowd goes wild, and Arya feels Baelor's statue rocking under her. The High Septon, still in a near fetal position, clutches at Joffrey's cloak. Varys comes rushing forward, waving his arms, thinking, oh my God, my 20-year plan to put some Blackfire on the throne is suddenly running into complications. And even Cersei is trying to say something like, but Joff, my good boy Joff, I must advise you otherwise. But Joffrey shakes his head, and everyone moves aside. Damn, it's almost like an indictment of an entire feudal society, right, Emmett?
Don't bring up politics, Jeff. That's just cheap and tawdry of you.
It really is. In a book called A Game of Thrones, bringing up politics is really cheap and tawdry of me. I apologize to no one because I will never apologize for anything ever. Through the gap, a tall man steps forward. It's none other than the prologue point of view for the Winds of Winter, Sir Ilyn Payne. He's not confirmed to be the prologue character, guys. I know I'm going to get 1,000 messages about that. Sansa falls to her feet, sobbing hysterically, and Sir Ilyn climbs the stairs towards Ned at the pulpit. Arya scrambles off Baelor's statue, drawing needle. She lands on someone, bowls over him, and pushes towards the front. Arya slashes at people with needle in a blind fury. Above her, Ilyn Payne gives the signal to a knight in black and gold, and the knight gives the command. The gold cloaks throw Eddard Stark to the ground. Someone shouts at Arya, but she moves beyond his reach. Someone reaches for her leg, but she kicks it aside and hacks at it with her sword. Yikes, a lot of kind of blind violence in this chapter. Arya slashes her sword at people, trying to get to Ned. But it's no good. There are too many people. She can't make it in time. Sir Ilyn draws a massive two-handed great sword from behind his back, and Arya realizes that this guy, this motherfucker, has ice. Ned's sword. Tears come streaming down her face, and then a hand reaches out and grips her arm. Needle goes flying from her grasp, and Arya is pulled to the span. A face comes within a centimeter of hers. Don't look. Arya sobs, and the man shakes her. Shut your mouth and close your eyes, boy. And then it comes. Dimly, as if from far away, she heard a noise. A soft sighing sound, as if a million people had let out their breath all at once. The man holds onto Arya. Look at me. Yes, that's the way of it. At me. The old man's breath smells like old wine. Remember, boy? Arya does remember. The smell is kind of what does it. The old black cloak over a twisted shoulder helps her memory even further. This was the Night's Watchman who had visited Ned after she was in the Black Cells. Know me now, do you? There's a bright boy. But now the deed is done, and Arya is coming with this man. The press dissolved around them as people drifted back to their lives. But Arya's life was gone. Numb, she trailed along besides Yoren. Yes, his name is Yoren. She did not recall him finding Needle until he handed the sword back to her. Hope you can use that, boy. Arya starts to protest that she's not a boy, but Yoren shoves her against a doorway. Not a smart boy, is that what you mean to say? As Yoren holds her with one hand, Arya sees he has another knife in his other hand. And the end of the chapter, oh wow, I had really actually forgotten how this chapter ends because it ends on such a fucking cliffhanger. As the blade flashed toward her face, Arya threw herself backward, kicking wildly, wrenching her head from side to side, but he had her by the hair, so strong. She could feel her scalp tearing, and on her lips, the salt taste of tears. And that is, at Game of Thrones, Arya 5. Everyone in the chat and everyone who's listening now can now let out their breath. They've been holding now, but wow, just wow. I mean, look, I remember, like, I don't know about you, but I remember where I was when 9/11 happened, what I was doing. I was in my basement, not at school, where I should have been, when my mom came down to tell me that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. I remember where I was when I asked my wife to marry me. I was in my old apartment, and we were watching The Hangover, and I excused myself to, quote, use the bathroom, but I went to get the ring instead. And I also remember where I was when Ned Stark was executed. It was June 2011. I was in my basement apartment at my brother's house. I had just been home for about 6 months from Afghanistan, and I was watching this episode on my laptop. And I just knew that Ned was going to make it. You can't kill Ned, guys. He's a main character. You can't. You can't. You can't. You did. Oh my God, you did. So, Emmett, where were you when Ned Stark was executed?
I remember being outside. I was on the porch reading it. And I didn't even think about whether Ned Stark was going to live or die because I was just flipping through the pages so quickly and waiting to see what happened. And then what was just so devastating was how it was described, that sudden sigh, that soft moment when it's like everyone's breath went out. And that was just devastating because it wasn't this big, loud moment that just exploded on the page. It was so quiet and so fragile. And then that devastating line, but Arya's life was gone. And it just, I mean, this event has a reputation of just like, exploding your brain. And it does to a certain extent, as you were describing. But I didn't expect it to be so quiet. And I just felt just like kind of sad and alone. And it was so fragile and so haunting. And I'll never forget that first time.
Yeah, it's so devastating of a moment. And like, look, I know like in retrospect, you're like, oh, well, Ned Stark's not the main character in Song of Ice and Fire. But would you actually get that impression from reading a Game of Thrones the first time or watching season 1 of Game of Thrones, a TV show? No, I mean, he's a huge, major, mega star who had been in numerous movies. And yes, we had to put aside always that feeling like, oh, Sean Bean always dies. They're like, no, Sean Bean's not. He's going to make it this time, guys. He's really, really going to make it. But no, and that's really fascinating because this chapter is so similar to it, it's one of those things that when you look at it, it's one of the two major moments in A Song of Ice and Fire when people think about the series of books as it is and the TV series. It's basically, there's a third moment too. It's basically when Ned Stark dies, another event, and of course Jon Snow's death at the end of A Dance of Dragons. Those are the three major events that people look at A Song of Ice and Fire as. But yeah, it's such a seminal moment and so iconic in this series and in fantasy and fantasy fiction altogether.
The third event being the Red Wedding, of course. And yeah, other than the Red Wedding, this is the single most iconic, most remembered and discussed event in both A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones. I think this is probably the best adapted moment in the show, in my opinion. I think, as I'll talk about near the end of the episode, I think you could argue they made it even better than it is in the books. It's a landmark in pop culture. As you were saying, everyone kind of remembers where they were the first time they read it. And it's so perfectly set up. Our hero, Ned Stark, father to his children and his men, driven first like a noir detective to find the truth, and then like a paladin to save innocent lives from that same truth, is bruised and battered and brought low in every fashion. A war for all Westeros hangs in the balance, with an even greater threat looming on the northern horizon. And here comes Joffrey, the shining golden prince at the end of the rainbow. He's going to spare the white heart and heal the land like in Sansa's stories. And he turns to her with a smile, and then he pulls out a knife and cuts the poor thing's throat. The blood spills over the pale marble. The dream is defiled. The prince is a monster, and the war spreads outward from the sacrifice of our protagonist. It's a narrative prism, like if you imagine like the cover of Dark Side of the Moon. Like the story comes into this, and then it splinters out into 1,000 rays from this one dreadful, cathartic burst of energy. This is what the entire book has been building to. The overarching theme of loss that we've been talking about. The bright, shining possibilities of youth and song and fantasy giving way to the reality of mortality. Lyanna in her bed of blood and Robert in his. Sansa's cheers of joy at the hand's tourney cut short by Gregor Clegane's crimes, both past and present. Bran's dreams of knighthood dashed when a knight steps out of the stories and throws him for a fall. Ned's death is the fall, the ultimate incarnation of the fall from grace that is a Game of Thrones central subject. Coming back to it now, as we were suggesting by remembering when we first read it, it feels, perversely enough, like going home. Not to remember childhood, but to remember the moment childhood ended, the moment you grew up. To quote Ned, the moment when all the smiles died.
Yeah, that's a really, really good way of putting it. I mean, I feel like I'm not saying that George was like really like excited to like get to this and excited to have Ned Stark die, but it does feel like there's a sense of satisfaction in concluding his arc this way, in that it does deconstruct some, fantasy tropes. I think that George gets this reputation of being the subverter of fantasy tropes of, oh, well, you think that nobody's safe, right? You think that that's actually what's going to happen. Nobody's actually safe. And you're like, well, yes and no. I mean, I mean, we have to be honest with ourselves, and I think George is honest too. And that yes, nobody is safe, and you want to be like terrified to turn the next page. At the same time, though, like there are certain safe characters that have been safe from the very beginning. And Game of Thrones season 8 and the end of it did show us potentially a version of who is going to ultimately be safe in the narrative. But Ned Stark is not safe here. Ned Stark's downfall is an excellent deconstruction of the heroic figure falling from grace. I mean, we all know that Ned has the most number of chapters in a Game of Thrones. He's got 15 chapters. A man who has 15 chapters who dominates practically a quarter of this book with his narratives, with numerous other Arya, Sansa, and Catelyn chapters revolving around Ned too. All of that builds to this event, and that does a great job of deconstructing who Ned Stark is and how his downfall comes about. Now, it's stupid, it's idiotic to say that Ned died because he was dumb. Because, as we talked about in previous episodes, Ned died because Joffrey is a fucking psychopath. It's not because like Ned was so stupid to trust the Lannisters and trust Varys and trust Littlefinger. I mean, he was maybe not quite so a little more should not have trusted Littlefinger, but the standards of Westerosi culture and politics means that Ned Stark should have survived. He should have made it through this moment. But because this story and this particular event are showing us feudal culture at its absolute worst, he can't. He can't survive. And of course, he can't survive too because of the narratives. But before we get to the actual death of Ned Stark, there is a lot of stuff in this chapter. Like I said, before we got to it, like 2/3 of this chapter has nothing to do at all with Ned Stark's death.
Yeah, for the first half of this chapter, it's Arya Stark, Dickensian orphan. It's very different. Like, this is kind of a weird chapter. As you said earlier, everyone remembers the second half, and the first half has some thematic connections to Ned's execution, but plot-wise, it really doesn't have anything to do with it. It's not the most, like, structurally exact chapter in the series. Like, we were comparing it to the Red Wedding, and you look at Storm of Swords, Catelyn 7, the main Red Wedding chapter, and like everything in that chapter fits together from the first words with the drumming and Catelyn feeling sick to her stomach. Every single word is perfectly in its place. This isn't exactly that, but the first half is still good. It's less about wrapping things up for book 1 and more in a variety of ways about establishing how Arya's story is going to work in books 2 and 3.
Yeah, I mean, it really, really is. And I think it's really fascinating too, because so let's go all the way apart from Arya Stark and talk about George R. R. Martin in 1996. So as you guys know, originally George R. R. Martin's conception was that he would end a Game of Thrones with the Red Wedding, which why, what? No, bad, George. So he makes the right decision to push the Red Wedding back. So he gets to he writes about 1,500 manuscript pages, if I'm remembering correctly, what folks like Adam Whitehead, aka Wordhead, have talked about George's process in writing a Game of Thrones. And he comes back and he's like, well, I've got like so many additional pages, but I want this book to be around 1,100 manuscript pages. So he took about 300 to 400 pages of extra material, then made that the opening chapters for A Clash of Kings. And you do wonder whether the way this chapter is written, whether at some point before George ended up writing A Clash of Kings, or deciding that he had to write A Clash of Kings rather, that he had this as a separate Arya chapter that would have kind of built a little bit more up to Ned Stark's execution. But then he ended up kind of going back and rewriting this chapter a bit and taking some of the narrative and the manuscript pages that he had written for this chapter, for a separate chapter that was before Ned Stark's execution, and having it kind of be the foundation for the Ned execution scene before then taking further Arya chapters. And I'm thinking specifically of Arya's first chapter in A Clash of Kings as one that George potentially took from the original Game of Thrones manuscript, cut it to the Clash of Kings itself, and then, of course, rewrote it a little bit as well. So I think that's a strong possibility here. And I do think there is some moments where I can almost see George's like rewriting hand here. I'll kind of point them out as we're going through this kind of depth section of this chapter. But I do think it's fascinating the way that George writes is that he is consistently pushing stuff farther and farther back. Like, well, we can't have the Red Wedding at the end of book 1, so it's going to be at the end of book 2. It's going to be the end of book 3. Daenerys Targaryen was supposed to gather up all the Dothraki at the end of book 1. No, at the end of book 2. At the end of book 3, 4, 5, hopefully 6, right? So I mean, like this is just kind of George's style here. I mean, we've got a friend, Mighty Isabel, who has always talked about that A Song of Ice and Fire is always just 2 books away from being completed. And that all goes all the way back to the very beginning where, George was only just 2 books away from being complete at the end of a Game of Thrones. And then, no, sorry to say, no.
Not so much. Yeah, I think that's a very strong argument, Jeff, especially if you look at the beginning of book 2 and Arya gets all these chapters right away before even a lot of characters get their first one. So that does feel like George moved a lot of that stuff that was originally at the end of book 1 into the beginning of book 2. And you can definitely see the seams to a certain extent, but there's still a lot of strong content in the first half here. Arya underfoot is going to be our eyes on the ground for the war raging in Westeros, in the Clash of Kings and the Storm of Swords, wandering through the dust left behind by all the crusading kings. And you can see the first half of Arya 5 as a kind of a dress rehearsal, wherein George tries out the tones and themes that are going to dominate that storyline. So there's a few elements here that are very key for Arya's story going forward. You have these constant threats to safety that are going to happen in the Riverlands that come up in this chapter. You've got kids attacking her, her stuff being stolen the first night. You've got like grown men staring at her and clearly thinking about sexually assaulting her when she's in the pot shops. You got soldiers on the hunt for her. There's just danger at every corner, and she's going to find that in Riverlands as well. You're going to find out with Arya's story that there's no worthy institutions to which she can appeal. Every time she's going to try to find, some larger authority that can help her in the Riverlands, it's pretty much always going to fall apart. Even with the Brotherhood, who she stays for a long time, she ends up feeling she can't trust them. She can't trust the faith in this chapter, that passing Septon who looks at her like, oh, what are you doing, when she's grabbing a pigeon? And it's like, oh, really? Like a member of the cloth? You're not like, oh, look at this poor orphan in the streets who clearly is desperate for food. Maybe I should take them in, as the Seven would want. No, he just looks at her and keeps walking. You're not going to find any quarter there, are you? She can't trust the gold cloaks, of course, and she certainly can't trust the crown, as we find out at the end of this chapter. And that same kind of feeling persists when she gets to the Riverlands. You have this sensation in the first half of this chapter of a city at war. You got the gold cloaks hunting for her and other Stark loyalists. You got, as you were saying in a synopsis, gossip everywhere, but precious little truth. Everyone is rising and falling. Janos Slynt is on the way up as the gossip talks about him making his way to the small council as a lord. Then you've got Ned falling. And that same sense of rising and falling fortunes and the chaos of war being a ladder is going to persist in the Riverlands as well. Just look at how many people run Harrenhal by the end. And then you have Arya's takeaway from all this, which is that violence is the only way to survive. She's killing pigeons at the start of this chapter. I mean, obviously, I understand she needs to eat, but like the way she's like thinking, this is easy compared to catching cats. Like that's the first sign that, oh, Arya's going to have to do some kind of shady stuff when she get out to the Riverlands. She's eating this meat at the pot shops, which she realizes is, some of this might be puppies. We know, as we'll discuss from A Storm of Swords, that some of it might be people. And then you have this haunting line. Her Lord Father had taught her never to steal, but it was growing harder to remember why. Ooh, that's just devastating, because she's now out of her comfort zone. She's out of this position where she doesn't have to worry about where her meals are coming from. Now she really has to worry. So this ethical prescription against thievery is being eroded away. And it's the first chapter away from home, and that's already setting in. Of course, we're going to see way more of that when we get to the Riverlands. And she's trying to fit in among the peasants, but they know she's not one of them. As she says, as soon as she starts talking, they start looking at her like, no, you're not from Flea Bottom. That's going to be a persistent theme when she gets to Harrenhal under Roose Bolton, and she has to like remind herself to talk like she's not highborn. And the bitter irony, of course, is that Arya thinks life is going to be so much easier if she can just make it out of the city. It'll be just like it was on the King's Road. I'll find berries and roots, and Tom Bombadil will be there, and I'll have just great dinner with him. And it's like, no, my poor sweet summer child. Things are going to get even worse on the road. And the only really silver line you can see established here that's going to keep going in her Riverland story is that she's got Sirio's teachings to guide her. When she goes to the port, that little scene at the Wind Witch, and she remembers, look with her eyes. So she knows, oh, these men are wearing Stark colors, but they're not my father's men. They're in disguise. They're looking for me. They're hoping to trick me and trap me. And so she has to pretend to be a boy. That kind of gender disguise is going to be a crucial part of her time in the Riverlands. But it's good to establish, with all the kind of misery and bleak stuff being set up in this chapter, it's good to set up her survival strategy being established as well. And a lot of that has to do with Sirio's teachings. Poor Sirio. Rip.
Rip, man. Rip, totally rip on him. But I think it's a fascinating point you bring up about how the institutions of King's Landing are failing her, whether it's going to be the cops, the politics, the religion too. But again, like, I think like a lesser storyteller than George would be like, well, all those things are bad. All institutions are bad, and we should be extremely cynical about this. And yes, Arya needs to learn a little bit of realism in learning that people, if they're wearing, a cop uniform, or if they're like holding like a cross or whatnot, are not necessarily out for Arya's best interests. Instead, she has to learn to distinguish people for who they are, regardless of what the clothing they're wearing. Which again, we did talk a little bit about that in Daenerys 8. If you guys have listened to that already, where we talked about in Harrenhal how Arya has to learn to distinguish that people who are wearing a Stark clothing and are carrying Stark banners are not necessarily good people. And that is very important for her arc, for her training arc. And a lot of these early Arya chapters, and especially the first 3 books in Song of Ice and Fire with Arya chapters, are not totally, but are an extended training montage, or not montage, extended training arc for her to progress her forward to the House of Black and White, where she engages in even further training that George R. R. Martin had wanted to kind of do away with the 5-year gap, so she can come out as a kind of fully fledged assassin and get onto her plot work in The Winds of Winter. But I think it's really good that George takes the opportunity to kind of learn Arya about like the hard ways of life, and life in King's Landing is really, really hard. People are not out for her best interest. People are potentially dangerous towards her, and people know that she's not one of them. And I think that's such an interesting distinguishment that George makes about Arya, that despite her being dirty, hungry, filthy, she still has enough accoutrements of high class and high culture and of the noble class of Westeros that people look at her, they stare at her, and Arya knows that they're staring at her. And it's really kind of sad, because like that means that she can't partake in this kind of common small folk culture in King's Landing. She stops going to Fleet Bottom to enjoy the bowls of brown, and she stops doing that because she realizes that people are going to look at her, chase her, and potentially, turn her over to the cops. And that's really kind of sad that she can only get so far, but she is still Arya of House Stark. She could pretend to be Ari in A Clash of Kings. She could pretend to be whatever type of person, Cat of the Canals, and these different characters in A Feast for Crows, but she's still going to be Arya Stark. Now, that is a good thing ultimately, because that will be what brings her back to Westeros, likely in The Winds of Winter. But at the same time, that the fact that she is Arya of House Stark is a form of danger to her. So she's trying to fit in, but she can't necessarily fit in, and that leads to a lot of consequences, external and internal. And I do really, really enjoy that scene from the ports. I had not totally forgotten it, but when I reread this chapter, I was like, oh yeah, this is where this happens at, where she's there and she starts to she takes her experiences in Fleet Bottom essentially, and realizing that people are not out for her best interest. She takes the things that Cyril Farrell has taught her about, look with your eyes, child. And she looks with her eyes and sees these men there, and she's like, I know all of my dad's guys. These guys are not my dad's guys. So the fact that she's able to make that distinction and is able to make a smart on-the-fly decision in order to prevent herself from being captured really speaks to Arya as a character, and speaks to her learning and growing. I mean, there's little moments throughout this chapter where they talk about where George talks about how Arya learned to walk through the center of the street, which is something that she learned very early on, which is really, really good. And she's, learning as well to kind of let the crowd push her forward when she gets to Baelor Sept itself. Things that she's learning on the streets, which are fascinating and which help to grow Arya and make her a character that is not necessarily, and this is a key distinction as well, is not necessarily the eyes of the small folk in A Clash of Kings, but gives us a perspective on the small folk in A Clash of Kings and on into A Storm of Swords.
I think that's a really good distinction. It's not like Arya becomes a peasant or adopts their interests or is able to shed her noble background. And that tension is a really important part of her story. Like you see that with Gendry in A Storm of Swords, when he gets really jealous of Edric Dane because he has a noble background and can kind of talk to Arya that way and he can't. And so much of Arya's story is about passing, about succeeding at passing and failing at passing in various forms. Her pretending to be a boy when it's useful to her, but then, Gendry finds out immediately. She adopts all these different names, but Jaqen H'ghar sees right through her. And when you get to the Faceless Men at the House of Black and White for Arya and Feast and Dance, that's a whole different kind of passing at a metaphorical level where you're literally putting a new face on instead of just metaphorically. And yeah, I think it's really important to consider how Arya deals with this morally, and how she's kind of crumbling and afraid inside, and she's not able to fully negotiate these new relationships. And it's going to be important when she gets to the Brotherhood, and it's going to be important in her dealings with the Faceless Men. But then we transition away from that as the bells start tolling. The bells, those ever important bells in King's Landing. And then we get the reveal that Ned's being taken off to be executed. And I love how George does this, because he first puts that idea that Ned's going to be executed in the mouth of this boy that's running off to the square to answer the summoning. So, first time through, we're tempted to go, oh, that boy's just lying or exaggerated, like he's just caught up in the excitement. He doesn't really know what's going on. And he has the other peasants doubt it. One of them says, they ain't either going to lop him. Since when do they nick traitors on the steps of the Great Sept? Which a fair point, but one might as well ask, since when do they kill guests at a wedding? Taboos are being broken. It's fitting the theme of instability and danger that was early on in this chapter, where Arya realizing, oh, I can't rely on social niceties to protect me anymore. And the same thing is true at a political level, that Joffrey's going to break taboos and really break his own family's strategy to win the war. And I really love that when Arya hears this, that they're taking off the hand, her father, to potentially be executed, She doesn't like, lie on her back and scream at the sky like Point Break. There's a great moment in Hot Fuzz when they make fun of that. Did you ever shoot your gun in the air and scream No, I never shot my gun in the air and screamed And that would be fine, but I think you can see George thinking, this might be a little melodramatic. How do I handle this in a more subtle way? And I love it because right after she hears that, George describes how there was a rut in the road from a wagon. And the boy saw it, but Arya never did. Why? Because she's running so fast. Because she just heard this heart-stopping, heartbreaking news that her father might be executed. So she's not looking. And she falls in and she gets injured. Her thumbnail breaks open and it's blooding and she's sobbing. And that gets across the emotion of the moment without like pausing the action for a paragraph to describe Arya's inner monologue. No, my father, it can't be. Like, that would be fine. That's like the instinctive thing to do with this scene. But I love that George frames it in a different way. And it keeps going when the red ones almost run her down. Horror and slobber, of course. Again, that reflects the class dynamics that will dominate Arya's story going forward, that she has to jump out of the way lest these nobles, literally run her down with her horses. But it also reflects the end of her innocence. Like she says, these are the guys that Sansa and Jane used to make fun of back in happier times, back when Dad wasn't a prisoner, back when we hadn't, had the Tower of the Hand just overrun and everyone killed. They don't look so silly now, she thinks to herself. Nothing looks silly to Arya now. Nothing looks fun or childish to Arya now because that's all going away. And she pushes and shoves her way through the crowd, these masses that will slowly vanish over the course of her storyline until you get to like the end of her Storm of Swords storyline and the Riverlands feels like empty. Like most of the people are gone and it's just ash and dust. Empty space comes to dominate war-torn Westeros, even more so when you get to A Feast for Crows. And you have this image of only Baelor being able to save her, like only the statue is there. Like this religious king is like a god reaching down his hand from the heavens to pluck up Arya Stark, and she's praying to the gods to save her, but save her father. But of course, no gods hear her prayers. And Baelor, for all that he was religious and believed himself the avatar of the Seven to a certain extent, is just a statue of a long dead man, like the Crips. If the Seven exist, they don't care enough to intervene. Speaking of which, as you said earlier, Ned makes an interesting reference to them in his confession, sir. You wanna tell the people about that?
Yeah, so let's go back to the confession that he makes there when he's standing up there on the steps of Baelor. So as you guys, let the chat kind of like talk amongst themselves and start debating. And yes, guys, I do know what pegging is, but I'm not going to say here because this is a family podcast. So shut the fuck up. Thank you very much. Family podcast. Shut the fuck up. All right. So in Ned's confession, he says the following things, which I think is very, very interesting. And he says, quote, sorry about that. Let me find it. He says, quote, "I betrayed the faith of my king and the trust of my friend Robert. I swore to defend and protect his children, yada, yada, yada." And then he says, here's the important part. "Let the high septon and Baelor the beloved and the Seven bear witness to the truth of what I say. Joffrey Baratheon is the one true heir to the Iron Throne, and by the grace of all the gods, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and protector of the realm." Well, what do you guys think? Do you think that Ned swearing to the faith of the Seven is, something that we should be taking like without like a grain of salt, or is Ned basically going wink, wink, nod, nod? Guys, remember me? I'm Ned Stark of House Stark from the north of Winterfell. What do I pray to? Who do I pray to? I don't pray to some fucking faith of the Seven. I pray to the old gods and let them bear truth and bear witness to the things that I believe in and what I'm actually confessing. So what Ned is essentially communicating there to anyone who is smart enough to hear it is that he is making a false confession, and he is saying he's making a confession under extreme duress too, as you guys all well know, because of course Varys had threatened Sansa's life in Eddard 15, which we covered with our friend Lauren, aka Shakes of Thrones, a fantastic, wonderful singer who did a really, really cool version of Jenny's song. If you guys want to go ahead and look at it, so take a look at her on her SoundCloud page if you guys have any opportunity to do so. But in that chapter itself, Varys threatens Ned and through his children. He doesn't threaten, like Ned is basically like, yeah, you just kill me, whatever. I don't give a shit. I'm a soldier. I can die whenever I want to. I've made my peace with dying long ago. But when he threatens Sansa, then he finally relents. But here he's basically doing the thing, like if you guys remember from I don't know how this comparison is going to go, or probably like a lead balloon, as most of my comparisons do. But during the Vietnam War, Air Force and Navy pilots who were captured by the North Vietnamese, they took taped confessions of them saying like, "Oh, we're being treated very well here," and at the prison in Hanoi, Vietnam. There they feed us every day. We sleep on feather beds, and then they would blink Morse code, being like, no, that's actually really wrong. Like we're being tortured. I think the one guy blinked out torture when Norse code with his blinking with his eyes, and that's basically what Ned is communicating here. That that essentially like he's making a false confession because no, he would never swear an oath to the seven in front of everyone. So that's basically what I was referring to earlier. I think it's a really cool point that we have Ned kind of communicating subtly. It's showing that Ned isn't dumb. In fact, he's quite clever and quite wise here. So that, if somebody came back on him, because he's not expected to die here in this scene, he could be like, no, like I swore in front of the faith of the seven. I only swear to the old gods. So anyways, I just think that's an interesting kind of touch and something I never saw before I reread this chapter for this podcast.
That is a great catch. It's like when Ned, assigned or wrote the will a little differently than what Robert told him to, so he could make Stannis the heir. It's interesting. You have these little hints around the edges that Ned is not quite as simple a character as his reputation suggests, which is going to be true also of Davos Seaworth when we get into him. He's, I think Davos has a little more darkness and wildness to him than his squeaky clean reputation suggests. And dude was a smuggler forever, so it's not like he's not got some wildness to him. But yeah, that's really heartbreaking because you get at what's lost in this chapter. It's not just Ned, of course it is. It's not just the damage his death does psychologically to his children, although of course that's immense. It's that he takes this secret to his grave. It's that he doesn't get to go to the wall and tell Jon the truth about his parentage and maybe go back on his not actual oath here because of the loophole you're pointing out and say that no, Stannis is the true heir. All of that dies with him, and it's such a great parallel to at the beginning of the book when Ned beheaded someone with ice who also had a very important secret he took to the grave. When Garrett died, he took the secret of the White Walker's return with him to a certain extent. And now Ned is being beheaded at the end of the book with that same sword, and he's taking his own secrets with them. And you can just see the great structure of that and how George has kind of, as we were saying, kind of designed the whole book to reach this point, that this is really the climax. Obviously, there are incredible chapters that come after this. I wouldn't trade the ending of this book with the birth of the dragons for the world, but this is the climactic moment of a Game of Thrones for sure. And then we get to the execution itself. And I think we have to talk about Joffrey's smile when he smiles to Sansa right before he gives the order. For me, this is like the purest example of villainy in the series. It's not the most complicated. It doesn't have the biggest impact, but it's like the atomic core of awful, like stripping it down to its essence. Like one simple act, like Joffrey smiles just because he knows it'll hurt Sansa more if he does that. If he shows her and the audience the image of the perfect prince before snatching it away, there's no other reason to do it. It's so breathtaking in its pettiness and its cruelty. And that's why I look askance at any plan, be it Renly's or Tywin's or Littlefinger's, that involves this sadistic little fuck remaining in power. Like, you can't fix this. What's wrong with Joffrey? I don't think there's any way he could have been made a good king with that fucking haunting smile. And then he gives the command. And there's just nothing anyone can do, despite this being an affront to everyone involved and dumb on every conceivable level. Despite Cersei and Varys having this plan set up beforehand, there's nothing anyone can do. And as you say, there's a systemic critique there. If the rule you followed brought you here, of what use was the rule? What kind of worthy system puts Joffrey in charge? Like, that's not to say we enlightened moderns have figured out the problem of power. We have not. But that unchecked monarchy is being exposed as not only bad, but childishly bad. Pathetically bad, just wretched. It promises order, but offers madness and stupidity, if I may quote Tywin in the show. And then you have Yoren stepping in to save Arya in this moment of chaos. And that fits. Yoren, he stubbornly believes in the ability of the Night's Watch to bring order to chaos. I think he's a really politically interesting character, and that he believes the Night's Watch is kind of this unifying force for the realm and a force for good in this time of division and war. It's how you synthesize a genuine realm out of this madness. And that's a theme that's going to come up. We've been pretty harsh on the Night's Watch as an institution, like when we did our John 8 episode with Kim Renfro. But Yoren shows us an interesting side of it. And as you were saying earlier, it's part of Arya's process where she learns she has to judge people as individuals, not just the institutions they represent and not just the background. Because Yoren, he wears black and he's smelly and he's mean and in every possible fantasy trope kind of way, Yoren should be a villain, right? But he's kind of a jerk to Arya in a lot of ways, even as he's saving her life. But he's got this heart to him and this core to him that Arya actually finds really admirable, and that's why she's so really devastated in Clash of Kings when he dies. But again, it doesn't make him friendly. And in this scene, in the context of just this scene in isolation, he's just another threatening element that Arya can't understand or control, just coming out of nowhere and grabbing her. But he gives her this mercy. He knows what to say. Don't look. Don't watch this. And it's just this, as many people have pointed out, it's this inversion of Arya and Sansa's story, where Arya is generally shown more the actual effects of the war, and Sansa obviously sees and experiences a lot of violence in her own storyline, but Arya just sees these grotesque, over the top cruelties over and over again. But she's the one who doesn't have to witness this, and Sansa is the one who has to witness this, and it haunts her so much, as we're going to see in her last chapter. And again, you get that haunting moment that I was talking about with the breath going out of the crowd, just like the whispering wood letting out all its breath in the battle, as Catelyn described it in her 10th chapter. And then everyone else gets to go home, but Arya's life is gone, as George writes it. Everyone else can resume their business. And of course, because ultimately for them, what's another High Lord failing at the Game of Thrones? Why should they care? There's no reason for them to care. But for Arya, that's dad. That's her whole life. And I think George does want us to adopt that perspective. And we were talking earlier about, this as being a shocking moment, and the one that demonstrates that no one is safe and George is going to kill off main characters. And it is that, but that's what it was clearly in 1996, and that's what it was clearly in 2011. And I think at this point, we need to move beyond that. I think we need to move past Ned's death as genre deconstruction and realize it's tragedy. That's the core of what's happening here. Ned is not just being swept off stage to make way for the real protagonists. It matters. There is a Ned Stark-shaped hole in the story that follows, and in his children, and in us. He's this emotional and thematic presence still that defines so much of the story to come. Men's lives have meaning, not their deaths. And Ned's story, his life, it meant so much more than the image of an honor-bound fool. We see this most clearly in the books in A Dance with Dragons, when the clansmen we were talking about earlier are willing to fight and die for, quote, the Ned's little girl. Who's going to do that for Tywin Lannister? His legacy is a feast for crows. Ned's is a dream of spring. And the show adds another layer to this in my single favorite addition the show made to the canon, which is Ned shouting Baelor to Yoren when he sees Arya on the statue. And we see from his POV, him knowing in his final moments that it worked, that Arya got out alive. For once, he gets to actually save the children, and nothing goes wrong. He gets to go to his grave, knowing that at least he did that one thing right. And that's such a wonderful grace note to add for the character. And that's why I said earlier that I think this execution, so to speak, of this scene on the show is even better in the books. So, pour one out for Eddard Stark. He was a good man in a shitty world. He tried to do the right thing, and that's all any of us can do.
I think that's a really wonderful way of saying it. Yeah, he tried to do the right thing, and he did, ultimately. I love that invention by the show of Ned pointing out Baelor to Yoren, and his final act is saving children, much as the first, not his first actual act, but the first act we can assume is that he saves the life of Jon Snow by saving children. His entire life is dedicated to saving children and being horrified when they're not saved, in the cases of Rhaegar's kids by Tywin Lannister at the end of Robert's Rebellion. That's such a powerful theme in literature, and it's so strong of a theme in A Song of Ice and Fire. It goes beyond Ned Stark to, Ilaria Sand in A Dance with Dragons, talking about like all of these people who did wrong are dead, but you're endangering my own children and everyone's children to get your vengeance. Like, this is wrong. And that's so powerful. That goes throughout A Dance with Dragons as well. It's especially found in A Dance with Dragons and Dany's arc too, and other places as well. And I love the fact too, you're pointing out that Yoram, this dirty, grungy dude who probably listens to Soundgarden and, probably smokes a little weed and stuff like that, does all sorts of other sins, I'm assuming as well, is the guy that actually saves, Arya Stark. I was thinking, and because I'm not going to drop the opportunity to throw some shade at Sir Barristan Selmy, but I was thinking that we do know from Dance that Sir Barristan Selmy was also in the crowd at Baelor's Sept. And yes, I don't want to totally damn Barristan Selmy. He wouldn't necessarily been able to do this, but I was thinking it was an interesting touch on George's part to have the man in black save Arya Stark instead of the man in white, Sir Barristan Selmy there. That was an interesting narrative choice on Martin's part. Now, again, it's always a possibility that George later invented the fact that Barristan Selmy was in the crowd there and witnessed Ned Stark's execution. But I do think having Yoren contrasted against Barristan, having the ugly guy with the hunchback, the black cloak, his breath smells like wine, contrasted against the perfect knight, the guy that we're all supposed to aspire to. I think it's really, really powerful stuff too, that, these people that we often dismiss in society as being those unworthy of our loyalty and affection are the ones that often come out of nowhere. And out of nowhere, I mean, in the books at least, it's out of nowhere that Yoren comes and saves Arya's life. In the show, it's a little bit different, but I do love that invention in the show itself. But out of nowhere in the books, a guy in black who has seen Arya one other time in his entire life saves her life for no other reason then besides it's a good and noble deed. He doesn't have a sir in front of his name. He doesn't have a lordship behind him. He's a man of the Night's Watch, sworn to protect those who are underneath of the wall.
You nailed it, sir. Yoren's definitely one of my favorite minor characters for exactly those reasons you were outlining, and I can't wait to talk about him in Clash. But one thing I wanted to close out with before we talked about foreshadowing and groundwork is Ned Stark's bones. That's kind of a big thread left hanging in the series. It comes up when they get back to Riverrun in A Clash of Kings and Catelyn sees them and she sends them on north to Winterfell. And then we hear Barbary Dustin and Dance talking about how she has made sure that's not going to happen because of her bitter feelings about the Starks, similar to Theon's in a way, she points out. And I feel like a huge part of Endgame in the books, and for the Starks especially, have to be those bones coming home and those bones being put in the crypt and the kids finding some kind of closure. Like I would bet money that's going to be like Sansa's last POV chapter in the books, like the Queen in the North interring those bones and feeling a sense of, okay, it's now okay that Ned is dead. Because as we were talking about in our episode on Daenerys 8, the instinct to reverse this kind of horrible event and bring back your lost ones and bring back your innocence, while very understandable, is ultimately screwing with the laws of the universe, and only bad things are going to happen. So I think part of the Starks coming home and the Starks learning their father's lessons and proving, better, having a better legacy than Tywin Lannister's is making peace with Dad's death and allowing him to be with his family and allowing him to not just be an open wound in their lives anymore, allowing him to be the image of the father who loved them, was trying his best for them, and them able to access that together. I feel strongly that's going to happen in some form in the books because of the amount of setup, as I was saying earlier. And I really, that's going to be the moment, if we do get that in the books, where I will break down and cry for sure.
I would probably do the same, except for I don't cry because I'm a big, strong man. I only weep. But yeah, I think it's a
all right. That was a good one.
Boom. So I try to do what I can. But yeah, that's a fantastic point. I would love to have that as being the final moment in Winterfell, is Ned's bones returning back, and that allows the Stark children to have the closure to move on. And that is ultimately a Dream of Spring. You talked about Ned's legacy being a Dream of Spring and Tywin's being a Feast for Crows. A Dream of Spring is Ned returning to Winterfell to be buried next to his sister, his father, and his brother. And that is awesome. I love thinking about that idea. And I love the fact that, as sad as this is, a lot of times people look at funerals as a way for folks to kind of process their grief and move on, either the funeral or the wake, whatever your tradition is. And Ned deserves a funeral more than anything else. And I think for his kids, for George R. R. Martin, as well, as he concludes The Song of Ice and Fire, it's, next week or the week after that, in A Dream of Spring, but also for us as readers too. I mean, we're now, it's May 27, 2019, as we're reviewing and analyzing this chapter. We still feel that sense of sadness. I still feel that sense of sadness deep inside of my belly, soul. That's where my soul is, in my belly, right? I don't know, whatever. But I still feel that, and I feel like when Ned finally gets interred under Winterfell, that will be the final place where we as a fandom can move on from Ned Stark and ultimately move on from A Song of Ice and Fire, always keeping the memory alive, but being able to process those emotions in a good way, I think.
Yeah, exactly. You don't want the Stark kids to end up like Duran and Oberyn, whom I love dearly, but and their drive to get vengeance for Elia is certainly righteous and understandable, but it's also kind of ruined their lives. It gets Oberyn killed. It causes Duran to come up with this grand master plan that ends up really screwing over his kids. And I think part of the point is going to be the Starks, when we come back to them at the end of the story, moving on from that and loving their father, but not allowing the present to kind of become hostage to the past in the way it is for a lot of these characters. So I think that's going to be our final grace note for Ned Stark and his impact on the series. So moving on to foreshadowing and groundwork, we have been comparing Ned's execution to the Red Wedding, and perhaps the strongest link, besides the feels, is how the chapter ends. Very specifically with a Stark woman, Arya, being grabbed by the hair as a knife flashes towards her. And that is spookily similar to Catelyn at the Red Wedding, when she gets grabbed by the hair and thinks that devastating line about how Ned loves her hair, and then the knife comes towards her, and its bite was red and cold. As we always say with stuff like this, it's unlikely that George had this in mind when he was writing book one. But I got to feel like Ned's execution and the Red Wedding as these twin big events were probably present in his mind as well, not just ours. So maybe he deliberately wrote the end of the Red Wedding that way to kind of link back to this moment.
I think that's a fantastic point. And, another kind of like connection to the Red Wedding I was just thinking about is that This chapter is the death of Ned Stark, one of our point of view characters. And at the end of this chapter, it's a bit of a cliffhanger whether Yoren intends to actually murder Arya Stark there in the streets of King's Landing, which is the same exact goddamn thing that happens in the Storm of Swords, where, an axe comes out of nowhere. And that's the last thing we get from that next Arya chapter after Catelyn's, I want to say it's her 8th chapter. Is that where she actually dies in the Storm of Swords? 7th chapter. There you go. So after the 7th chapter, we get the Arya chapter, we get the outside the camps, Sandor Clegane fighting the Freys, and then all of a sudden that axe head comes out of nowhere in the darkness, and boom, we don't have Arya for another like 300 or 400 pages. Now, in this case, Clash of Kings comes out, they only had people who were reading a Game of Thrones back in 1996, which one of the people in our chat here, Laura B, is actually legit OG. She read the books back in 1996, 1997. They had to wait 2 years to figure out whether Arya Stark was actually dead or not. In A Storm of Swords, we only had to wait about, I think it's about 22, 23 chapters before we had an Arya chapter again.
For sure, it's a huge gap, and that's just to reflect the emotions of it, how just this lingering impact on the whole inside that you feel, which again gets at what I was talking about, that these aren't just characters being glibly wiped off the map because they're not the true protagonists. I mean, we're going to make the same argument with Robb Stark, that he often gets treated that way. It's like, oh, he was just kind of a fool, and he's a fake protagonist, and he really had it coming. And I really don't think that's at all what George intends. And I think Robb is written so beautifully and sadly in A Storm of Swords. And again, I think we should start framing these events not just as shocking deconstructive twists, because they're not shocking deconstructive twists anymore. We've been living with them for years. They're very familiar at this point, and we should be thinking of these as the high tragedy that George is including in his fantasy.
Absolutely. So a little bit more foreshadowing groundwork here. We do have Arya early in this chapter talking about Flea Bottom and the pot shops with their bowls of brown and all of the delicious, is it delicious? It's not delicious at all. Those unsavory ingredients that come back into extreme, they come back extremely relevant in A Storm of Swords when Tyrion has Sir Bronn, later Lord Bronn of the Blackwater, later Lord Bronn of Stokeworth, add the singer Simon Silvertongue to the pot. And that starts this whole motif in A Song of Ice and Fire about eating human flesh. Well, it doesn't quite start it. That's kind of always existing in the background, but it starts vaulting that forward to the to the point in A Dance with Dragons where we have, of course, Bran eating long pork out. Excuse me. Until in A Dance with Dragons, we have Bran eating long pork out north of the wall. We have Wyman Manderley feeding Frey pies to those people at Winterfell. And we can imagine that motif will continue existing in further and more gruesome detail come the Winds of Winter next week.
For sure. I love that you pointed out the motif of cannibalism. That's one of my favorite aspects of Dance, is this. I mean, Dance, we love it so much. I think it's because it's so bleak and miserable. And that's definitely a huge aspect of it. You see in so many storylines. And I think George explores that for a variety of reasons, partially just kind of for the horror aspect of it all, but also to emphasize just the pitiless, wretched state of affairs as Westeros descends into war and winter. And, it makes perfect sense to have this cannibalistic attitude starting off this chapter, given how it ends. And the last bit of foreshadowing we're going to talk about here, one of the most direct, blunt bits of it, is right after the bells start ringing. And one woman leans out a window and says, is it the boy king that's died now? That's a boy for you. They never last long. And she's right. Joffrey doesn't survive book 3, as it turns out. The boy king doesn't last too long. Of course, it could also be referring to Robb, who's going to be a boy king by the end of this book and doesn't even last as long as Joffrey.
Yes, that is an excellent point, because Joffrey is he's going to die quite soon, like narratively speaking, in terms of the timeline. I think it's only about 8 to 10 months after this event that Joffrey is going to bite it, literally, in terms of biting an actual piece of pie. And that's going to be awesome when we get to that. Of course, George frames it in kind of an interesting way, and he tries to make Joffrey's death really heart-wrenching in the form of seeing Cersei witnessing it and stuff like that. But yeah, that's a boy for you. They never last long. Well, that is absolutely true. Joffrey is not going to last that long, and neither is Robb Stark. And, neither is Jon Snow, too. Kill the boy, as Baster Aemon says. And Jon is, all of 17 years old when he's stabbed at the end of A Dance with Dragons. And when he comes back, I don't imagine he's going to be a boy any longer. He's not going to be a boy much longer after that.
Well said. And of course, it applies to poor Tommen as well, who might be the single most doomed character going into the Winds of Winter. Everything is pointing to Tommen dying, and it's going to be pretty horrible. So that's, that's fun. What a fun time we're having. Look at the fun we're having, to quote Show Tyrion. So that about wraps us up for foreshadowing and groundwork. Moving on to our discussion section. On the surface, it seems pretty clear who bears responsibility for Ned Stark's execution, right? Joffrey.
Sure.
As established in Eddard 15, Cersei has arranged a deal to send Ned to the Wall in the hopes that Robb and his bannermen can be pacified so the Lannisters can deal with Stannis, who they consider to be the real threat. Joffrey altered the deal because he's an arrogant little prick who loves nothing more than public displays of violence and lacks even a rudimentary grasp of political and military strategy. This is repeatedly reinforced in A Clash of Kings early on. Cersei tells Tyrion about the plan and how her beloved perfect son messed it all up. And Yoren tells Arya that he was paid off by a mysterious stranger, aka Varys, to take Ned as well as Gendry to the Wall before Joffrey intervened. And thematically, that does work very well. The best laid plans go awry due to childish bloodlust that is enabled by a corrupt power structure, as we were saying. So, case closed. Thanks for listening. You can check us out at patreon.com/ASOIF. No. I think, way back when we covered Eddard 4, we argued that again, while on the surface, Robert seems to be responsible for the Crown's catastrophic finances. There are strong hints that it was actually Littlefinger as Master of Coin who broke the bank. Along the same lines, I would argue George has left us clues that Joffrey does not bear sole responsibility here, that Littlefinger urged him to execute Ned.
Yeah, I think there's a strong case to be made here that it's not necessarily just Joffrey acting out of pure cruelty. Now, is Joffrey capable of that type of cruelty? Yes, absolutely. Joffrey is very, very capable of cruelty. He is capable of violence. We see that especially in A Clash of Kings, where he takes out his nice crossbow and starts shooting at peasants who come begging for food, because that's something that a normal person does, right? No, of course not. So the interesting idea that has kind of surfaced since the Game of Thrones is this idea that it's Littlefinger who's the one who urged Joffrey to execute Ned. It is not officially confirmed by George R. R. Martin or either outside of the universe or within the books themselves, but Tyrion's chapters especially in A Clash of Kings and Tyrion's conversations with Varys do give some hint that potentially it was Littlefinger who was the one behind the scenes pulling the strings in order to get Ned killed. And let's talk a little bit about motivation here and what Littlefinger is hoping to get out of this. We do know that kind of chaos is a ladder, that kind of thing that Littlefinger talks about in season 3 of Game of Thrones. And Ned Stark's execution guarantees that shit's about to go real wrong. It's not just going to be the Lannisters versus Stannis and Renly. It's going to be the Lannisters versus Stanley versus Stanley. Goddamn.
Stanley, now there's a ship.
Oh gosh, I'm going to cover my head in shame with that. It's going to be the Lannisters versus the Starks versus Stannis versus Renly versus the Tyrells versus Dorne potentially. You have all these different factions that are playing out against each other, and Littlefinger is going to utilize that chaos to further his position in the realm. First, getting Harrenhal at the end of Blackwater and getting the alliance between the Lannisters and the Tyrells, and then later becoming Lord Protector of the Vale, because he's now the Lord of Harrenhal. He can marry Lysa Tully, and that Lysa Arryn at that point, and that will allow him to get more and more power and start to invest himself in more and more regions of Westeros, which will then, of course, factor into his plot line in the Winds of Winter, where he is looking to potentially gain the North too.
For sure. Littlefinger jumps on all these opportunities, and they're not immediately obvious in the first book. I don't think he's planned that many steps ahead, but he knows instinctively that this is going to create more opportunities for him to step forward, make him more useful to the Lannisters as they're in desperate straits. And then, of course, more personally, Littlefinger has this vendetta against House Stark, thanks to his duel with Brandon. That's clearly driving his resentment against Ned to a large degree. And he has already betrayed Ned once. Ostensibly, it was because Ned wouldn't keep silent about Joffrey's heritage. But in truth, I think we all know it's because Ned married Catelyn. He had the temerity to get the girl that Littlefinger wanted. Speaking of Cat, it's possible that Littlefinger still has an interest in her and wants Ned out of the way for that reason. He implies as much in season 2 when he runs into her at Storm's End, but that is kind of a show-invented plotline. And we do learn from Cersei's chapters in A Dance with Dragons that Littlefinger had already asked for Sansa's hand in marriage at this point and been rebuffed. So he might have already moved on in terms of which Stark Tully women he's going to project his insecurities onto. And as such, this might just be his way of getting back at Cersei by messing up her plans. Like, oh, she wouldn't let me, marry Sansa, so I'm going to screw up her peace deal and put the Lancers back. Littlefinger is often very, very petty in that regard, as we'll see with his dealings with Tyrion that you mentioned. So that kind of establishes... Oh, sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, yeah. Oftentimes, much like we talked about Tywin Lannister having very, like, shrouding his motivations in kind of this Machiavellian, the ends justify the means. I will do this horrible thing in order for the greater good to prevail. It's not actually what Tywin Lannister believes. He's actually much more invested emotionally in things than he lets on. And the same thing kind of goes for Littlefinger here, where he always talks about chaos is a ladder. As Aidan Gillen says, in the form of Peter Baelish. Was that Sean Connery?
He's Littlefinger.
Whatever.
Of miscastings.
I mean, the Irish and the Scottish are basically the same, right? The same accents too.
Wow, that's going to get you more hate than anything you've ever said.
Gosh, I can't believe that would get me more hate than everything I've ever said. But yeah, I mean, Littlefinger, though, ultimately, though, is much more a person who is very much feeding on those old grievances that he feels against the Starks and the Tullys. And he will often say that I'm doing this to cause chaos so I can advance. And it's just completely unemotional. It's just me building myself up slowly and slowly through war and chaos, when in fact he actually has more base motives and mind and more emotions that are at stake.
Yeah, Littlefinger thinks he's the Joker, but he's got these intensely personal motives that really drive him and kind of add a pathetic aura to the whole thing. So, we've established motive for Littlefinger being involved in this. Moving on to more kind of means and opportunity. While Joffrey does, of course, love being a tyrant and being in charge and making everyone dance at his whims, we also see him, given his age, repeatedly influenced by his elders. Cersei can't tell him what to do here, but she influences his opinions and worldview in a lot of ways. Robert, Joffrey seemed to have kind of a semi-hero fixation on and did some stuff to impress him. And as is intimated in Storm of Swords, he arranged for the Catspaw attack on Bran because Robert said it would be a good idea, and Mercy. Even Sandor is able to influence Joffrey in a lot of ways. So it's not out of the question that even Joffrey, hopped up in power, would be able to be manipulated by the right adult. We know he's vulnerable to flattery. We know from A Storm of Swords that he loves a sophomoric joke. And that seems to me like prime material for Littlefinger to schmoo the new king. Like he's going to make some sassy jokes and flatter Joffrey, and Joffrey's going to nod along and go, okay, I like this guy. I'll keep him around. We're going to see in Sansa 6, Joffrey at court doesn't handle 90% of the cases brought before him. Only the ones where he can inflict violence are the ones he's interested in. But it's not just Cersei he lets take most of those cases. He lets Littlefinger do it as well. So suggesting Littlefinger is actively taking a role in Joffrey's government. And it wouldn't be the only time Littlefinger uses his influence subtly from behind the scenes. As he describes how he spreads Joffrey's reputation at Bitterbridge. He praises the boy to the high heavens when he's talking directly to the Tyrells, but he pays his men to spread disturbing rumors. You can see him kind of working through a cutout here. It also wouldn't be the only time he commits murder via Catspaw in order to foster conflict. That's exactly what he did with Jon Arryn. He got Lysa to poison Jon Arryn and frame the Lannisters. He could be basically doing the same thing here. And then there's Janos Slynt, whom Cersei will later say went ahead as soon as Joffrey spoke without any word from me, which is interesting. Of course, Janos might just be following Joffrey's orders as a loyal, toady and stooge that he is. But it's interesting that Cersei is so irritated by this and that George has her talk about it because, well, you might think maybe Janos Slynt is taking orders from someone else. Who might he follow? Well, what does Littlefinger say in Edward 13? The Gold Cloaks follow the man who pays them. And Littlefinger is the man who pays. So maybe Janos Slynt was so ready to go because he already knew about the plan. Littlefinger, it kind of tipped him off and was like, don't let Cersei stop you. Don't look to Cersei all confused when Joffrey gives this order. Immediately do it. What convinces me above all, though, is there's this subtle but telling omission as everything goes to hell in this chapter. When Arya describes the various nobles on the dais, when she's first on Baelor's statue looking at everybody, she establishes that Littlefinger is indeed present, as you pointed out in your synopsis. She thought the short man with the silvery cape and pointed beard might be the one who had once fought a duel for Mother. Yet, after Joffrey gives the order, Littlefinger is not among those protesting it. We see Varys run over. We see Cersei whispering in Joffrey's ear. We see the High Septon affronted by this insult to his face. But Littlefinger? He doesn't move a muscle. And this is in spite of Cersei saying in A Dance with Dragons that he helped arrange this deal to send Ned Stark to the wall. So why isn't he as upset as Varys? Because for him, it's all going according to plan. He lit the fuse, and now he gets to sit back with that smug smile on his face and watch as the dynamite go off. Everyone else in this scene is yelling and shaking their fists and running over and causing chaos. Sansa's crying. Arya's trying to slash her way through the crowd. Littlefinger is just sitting perfectly still. And obviously that's subtle. You could easily say I'm making too much of it, but it feels like a notable omission on George's part to me.
It does feel like a notable omission. And if you watch the scene from Game of Thrones season 1, episode 9, you will notice the same sort of staging happening where you have everyone running over and trying to convince Joffrey to stop. Even Cersei is there being like kind of like reaching out for Joffrey, and he like kind of brushes her off. But they do have one shot of Littlefinger just kind of standing there, like above it all. He's got nothing on his mind besides just watching the chaos play out as if he expected it. And, again, the showrunners are also not going to establish that, are not going to say like, well, when George told us that when that Littlefinger was behind this, but at the same time, they are establishing that not meta, but within the narrative itself, that Littlefinger just stands there, looks on as if he has just won the greatest victory in his entire life. He has gotten his revenge on the Starks. He's gotten his revenge on the Tullys in some sense with the war that he started in the Riverlands. And now all he has to do is stand back and watch the man who had stolen Catelyn Stark in his own mind, because he's a fucking lunatic and fucking psychopath, stand back and watch that guy die in front of him. And that's got to be so satisfying for such a fucking psychopath like Lord Littlefinger.
Yeah, this really makes you hate him more than ever. There's so many good reasons to hate Littlefinger. Jane Poole's treatment, I think, is just number one on my list personally. But if Littlefinger is indeed responsible for what happens here, then once again, just as with poisoning Jon Arryn, he has plunged the continent into a civil war that will kill, injure, and dispossess thousands, all because he didn't get the girl. To be clear, as I've said before, I think Littlefinger actually does have a legitimate grievance against Hoster Tully, specifically, for how the latter treated him and Lysa. And if all Littlefinger did was work to weaken Riverrun politically, I would understand that. It still wouldn't be the best, most mature thing to do with your life, but I would understand it. I wouldn't be telling him to go die in a fire, as I am now. But Ned has never done Littlefinger any wrong, other than pulling the dagger on him when Littlefinger was basically begging him to do it. Jon Arryn did even less than that. He, raised Littlefinger up. They gave him a job, and all they did was make the mistake of trusting him, and he delights in their deaths for that reason, because he got them to trust him. And, given that he's already trying to marry Sansa, there's such a dark level to this where he might be arranging Ned's death, not just out of his vendetta, not just because of the Civil War, not just to spite Cersei, but to isolate Sansa, to take away her primary protector and guardian. Just look at how he manipulates her after killing Lysa, convincing her that she, quote, has no friend but Peter, and has no choice but to put up with his increasingly gross grooming of her in isolation. And, I think it's really telling that George chose not to show us Littlefinger actively grieving for Catelyn after the Red Wedding. Sansa never walks in on him crying, and he tells her it was about her mother, because he doesn't actually view the Tully/Stark women as people. They're just props in his personal revenge play. There's no humanity left in the dude at all. And, Littlefinger's death was the unquestioned highlight of season 7, as far as I'm concerned. And after rereading this chapter and contemplating his possible role in Ned's death, I am more eager than ever for his downfall in the books, which I don't know if it'll look exactly like it did in season 7, but I am positive that Sansa will be the instigator behind it. And one of the many layers to that is she will be getting justice for her father.
I agree. And that's the idea of justice is the really key theme here. Yes, it will be emotionally satisfying for us to watch Littlefinger die. It was emotionally satisfying for us too in A Dance with Dragons when John orders Ed to fetch a block to kill Janos Slynt. But that decision, as well as the decision to kill Littlefinger, will be framed, I believe, as justice as opposed to vengeance, as opposed to this satiating our deep need to have something bad happen to someone who has done bad things. It's a completely understandable motivation, and it's a completely understandable motivation that you have characters like Doran Martell saying that he is out to kill the people who perpetrated horrible atrocities on his family at the end of A Feast for Dragons. A Feast for Dragons, oh my God. At the end of A Feast for God, I'm just like fucking up this entire goddamn podcast this week.
He says that every week, folks, and it's never true.
Well, I appreciate that, but my gosh. But yes, vengeance, justice, fire, and blood. What that actually means is that innocents are going to suffer as a consequence to satiate Doran Martell's very personal and very emotional need for vengeance. When the event happens in A Dream of Spring, I have to imagine, I think Littlefinger is going to be, unfortunately, be around for the duration of the Winds of Winter. I don't imagine he's going to die at some early juncture at the Winds of Winter, at the juncture of the story, because I know Jinx is listening in. I think that he's going to be around for a while, and I think he's going to continue doing horrible, terrible things in the books. I think that Sweet Robin will likely be one of those characters that will die at Littlefinger's hands, whether it's through the poison plot that he's instigating with the maester up there. I think it's Maester Coleman, or whether there's some other way he's going to try and kill this boy. We're all going to look at Littlefinger and be like, yeah, he is such a slimy piece of shit and he needs to die like right now. But when it actually comes, it will be because of the crimes that he committed, and it will be a just act in the books. Now, again, personal feelings about the death penalty aside, the same thing happened in A Dance with Dragons with Janos Slynt and Jon, where Jon has Janos Slynt killed and executed, not because he is satiating his own need for vengeance, although of course it is emotionally satisfying for Jon, as he points out in the chapter right before he arrests Janos Slynt, but because Janos Slynt has disobeyed a direct order from his Lord Commander. Lord Littlefinger has done numerous terrible crimes during his reign as Master of Coin, as Lord of Harrenhal, and as Lord, and will likely continue to do horrible things as Lord Protector of the Vale. His death will be the just comeuppance of that, as opposed to the vengeance that we so need. It'll be justice, and I think it will be satisfying too.
Well put, sir. I mean, you're comparing it to the Martells, and as we were saying earlier, you certainly sympathize with them, given the horror inflicted upon their family. But it's, as Ilaria says, when you get to Dance, the people who actually did that are all dead now. Tywin's dead. Amory Lorch is dead. Gregor is, I mean, technically alive, I guess, but I would call that worse than dead at this point. Again, like we were saying in our episode on Game of Thrones, Dany 8, death is cleaner than what blood magic will do to you. And so there is a sense that the Martells should not, certainly not forget they're dead or forget what's done to them. But, as Jon says in the show, in Hardhome, you don't have to forget you're dead. You can still honor and respect them, but without consuming the present and consuming the future in your children's lives in this endless pursuit of vengeance. And I think getting rid of Littlefinger is going to be a little different than that, because he's still actively causing problems, and he's still actively working at the downfall of House Stark and House Tully and seizing all this power for himself. And of course, he's just so personally reprehensible towards Sansa and Jane Poole. So I think that will be one of those rare situations like Janos Slynt, where George frames an execution as not just the right thing to do, but there is some genuine catharsis and closure to it. And once again, I could not possibly be anticipating it more.
I absolutely agree. So I think that about wraps us up for this episode on the Game of Thrones Arya 5. If you guys are still listening in on the chat and watching us, we will stick around for let's call it about a half hour or so, till around, say, 11:15. Does that sound good to you, Emmett?
Absolutely.
11:15 on Freedom Standard Time. That is Eastern Standard Time. We'll stick around and talk to the guys and answer questions, do all those sorts of stuff. So, as always, thank you everyone for listening. Please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, SoundCloud, Podbean, and we are now available on Spotify too, as we've said a few times now. So go ahead and check us out there.
For sure. Check out our Patreon if you haven't at patreon.com/NotACast ASOIAF. Patrons get early access to our weekly episodes, access to patron exclusive episodes, the chance to ask us questions on the podcast, and much more. So check that out. You can follow us at NotACast ASOIAF on Twitter, or shoot us an email at NotACastASOIAF@gmail.com. You can find me at Port Quentin on Twitter.
And you can find me at Brendan Bfish on Twitter, Brendan Bfish on Reddit, and my website is warsandpoliticsviceandfire.wordpress.com. So earlier we said that we would answer the riddle that Lady B-Word had posed to us. And let me read that one more time for you guys, so everyone can make their final guesses as to who she is actually referring to. So her riddle says, I am the link to both of your names. I forfeited all my claims. I fought with the fish. I saw the frog die. When my time is due, will anyone cry? All right, you got 10 seconds to figure out, to make your last and final guesses as to who this riddle refers to.
Dun, dun, dun.
Dun, 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 dun.
Na, 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 na.
Dun. Okay, time is up. The answer is Sir Barristan Selmy. The link to your names is your Twitter handles, Brendan Bfish and Porter Quentin, that is. He connects you both by fighting with the Blackfish during the Battle of the Stepstones and saw the frog, Quentin, die. He gave up his claims, well, you know that part. When my time is due, will anyone cry? Because he's changed sides a few times, and likely, he will, don't worry, and likely will change them again.
We'll see about that. But no, it's an excellent riddle and a perfect link between us. And yeah, maybe my favorite Barristan scene in the whole story is when he looks upon Quentin's face one last time, and just like how his eyes have turned to pus, and thinks about, man, not all people are meant to have a hero's journey and be this fantasy protagonist, and he should have just stayed home. He should have had this simple life onto himself. And you get this sense of, because so much of Barristan's chapter is about how old he feels, and you get the sense when he's looking at Quentin, he's like looking back through time at his younger self and thinking, wow, everyone who was around me when I was a bold boy at Blackhaven is gone. They've all gone to ash and dust, just like this poor kid. So when we get to A Dance with Dragons in the 2030s sometime, we'll spend a lot of time on that. So thank you, Lady B-Word, for the riddle. Check out her riddles if you haven't already. Over on Twitter, and join us next week for Bran 7 as we continue the pattern established in this chapter of Ned Stark's children facing his death with Bran and Rickon. And then after that, we have Sansa dealing with it, and Jon and Robb. Once again, look at the fun we're having.
So much fun mourning for Ned Stark here in this tragedy of a fucking book. So much fun. So thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you for those who joined us for our live stream. Again, we will stick around to about 11:15 and chat and talk with you guys. And we will see you guys next week.
All righty.
All right. Stop the recording on Audacity.
Our recordings are stopped. Thanks so much for listening and hanging out, guys, in the chat. We love to have you here. As we said, this chapter feels like such a communal event in terms of the emotions we all have around it and bring to it and discuss with it. So there's no better scene, I think, to do this live cast for.
Yeah, this is so much fun to do this with you guys. I mean, I've been sort of monitoring the chat. I hope you guys have I see all the shade being thrown at me by the Girls Gone Can. I see you, Chloe. I see you, Eliana, too. I see you, Joe the Magician. I see everyone in the chat now.
I've been encouraging them in their degeneracy, as is my duty.
I didn't want to call you out, sir, because you are, my hero and idol, and I would never do that. But I have seen it too.
Good. I'm glad you have.
Yeah. Okay, so now that we're not a cast after dark, we can kind of let our luxurious hair down. I'll turn my hat backwards so we know that it's good times now.
Oh my God, he's going to start doing Limp Bizkit. Run. End the live cast. Undo.
Oh, no, we're not doing Limp Bizkit. We're doing Kid Rock. Ball with the ball, the bang, diggy, diggy, said the boogie, said up, drop the boogie.
It's just embarrassing. I don't know him. I didn't come with him. He doesn't even go here.
Oh, my gosh.
I'm just going to quietly sing like Radiohead ballads to myself in the corner.
Please don't. Just quietly, as long as it's not audible.
Okay, it works for me.
All right, so you have the opportunity for a little while to chat, say what you need to say, ask us questions. We love answering questions. As you guys know, we start all of our episodes with our NotACast patron questions from all of our $10 above Sworn Sword patrons. Thank you to all those who are Sworn Swords and above who ask us questions. You make our podcast great and fantastic. But now's your opportunity. We got to let our hair down. My hat is on backwards now. Emmett is there humming Radiohead to himself quietly. Very, very quietly. I can't even hear it on my headphones. And you guys can ask us questions. So what do you guys have for us? What do you want to know about A Song of Ice and Fire?
Micah Clark asks, what do you think about the Red Wine twins? Do you think George made them specifically to keep the Red Wine fleet at bay to be used later? And yeah, that sounds about right to me, that George wanted the Cersei to have the twins in her back pocket because he wanted the Red Wine fleet kept out of the war to be preserved later. Maybe that's an early hint that he's already thinking of Euron, because that's definitely where that direction is going currently in the plot. But of course, Euron really doesn't come up at all in book one. There's the 5-year gap to consider, so who knows what he had that fleet in mind for. But I think that's a good guess as to what their function is.
Right. I think like it's supposed to be like they're basically taken as hostages by Cersei in a Clash of Kings. They do hold the Red Wine fleet at bay. I get it, right? At bay, right? Because it's their ships and the bay is a body of whatever. So I think they are held at bay by Cersei taking them hostage. The Red Wines, I don't remember if they actually sail, because basically the Red Wine fleet comes back all the way to King's Landing, and then immediately when they get there, they're ordered to ferry Lannister troops onto Dragonstone to take it, and then they go after that to they sail back around the Arm of Dorne back to go confront Euron too. So are the Red Wine twins aboard the fleet? I don't remember off the top of my head. Do you remember?
Weren't they among the people that are being accused of sleeping with Marjorie and her handmaiden?
Oh, right. I think you were right. Yeah.
So I think they're still hanging around King's Landing for that reason. We'll see what happens. Obviously, they're not exactly the most developed characters. Same with someone like Jalabar Zoe, another kind of King's Landing layabout who gets accused. These are not the most compelling characters, but the Red Wines are interesting purely in that sense of being connected potentially to the plot of the fleet. Koi Venosi asks, how many, if any, new Valyrian steel swords will we see in the Winds of Winter? Got to imagine Dark Sisters coming into play at some point. I don't know if George has actually confirmed that, but he's just, he's teased that out about what happened to it, and then it might pop up again. Blackfire might come back into play. There's that earlier draft of Tyrion's third chapter in Dance that hinted Illyrio has it and is holding it for young Griff, so maybe that'll come out. What other ones am I forgetting? Something, Jeff?
I see. I've always said this. I don't find a lot of enjoyment in like the swords of Song of Ice and Fire and the Valyrian steel swords. I know like so many people are like super into them, and that's fine. It's fine that you're into swords. That's your thing. I just I know it's kind of weird because I'm into like the military side of the series, but why wouldn't I be into like the swords themselves? But I don't know why. So like any of the Valyrian steel swords that could come into play. I know there's the Valyrian steel Arak that one of the the windblown guy that has
Cago Corpse Killer. I think he's the one with the Valyrian steel rock. Delightful name. The windblown is so subtle.
Right. Yeah, you got Casporio the Cunt and you've got Cago the Corpse Killer as the two windblown guys. I love the names they give them in A Dance of Dragons. Yeah, it's so cool there. We got Wolfman Zach who's asking us, are we going to have merch and stuff like that? It's print merch. Okay, so we have been talking a bit about this. We're not going to reveal exactly what we've been talking about yet. I think it's important that you guys know that we have plans that we are working through right now, and we do want to have stuff for you guys at some point down the road. We don't want to reveal exactly what that is, but I think you all will be quite pleased what we have in store for y'all.
For sure. Watch this space. Let's see what else we got. RJ Morrison asks, what dropped or morphed plot threads do you wish George had kept going with? We mentioned in our most recent NotACast episode before this that Ahai might have been interesting to see, might have not been. I would have loved to see like that Shrouded Lord chapter he wrote for Tyrion and Dance. Are there any other kind of loose dangling threads you wish had been more followed up, Jeff?
Off the top of my head, I do think that Dance chapter from Tyrion's perspective is still existing in some form.
Mm-hmm.
I remember right before the Balticon 2016, where George came and read the Forsaken chapter, where I got to be there when George read that Forsaken chapter. I do remember on George's Not a Blog, he was like, "Oh, I'm going to be there," and I was like, "Oh, I might do a reading," and I was like, "Hey, read that Dance chapter that you cut from A Dance of Dragons that became part of Tyrion 6. It's basically the only part of that chapter is the dream sequence from that opens the chapter where he's dreaming about Tywin as the Shrouded Lord and stuff like that. That's the only part that seems to have been retained in the actual published version of A Dance with Dragons. And George has talked about how he has been trying to find a place for that chapter itself where he might release that. I thought it'd be really cool. Potentially there's a upcoming anthology book called The Book of Magic. And I was like, oh man, it'd be so cool if George released that Tyrion Dance chapter for that book. But no, he has got something else I think coming out in that book, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, maybe we'll get to see it at some point down the line. But yeah, that would be really interesting because the comparisons to Tywin in that regard are fascinating. And I think feed really well into Tyrion's psychology and Dance. Our good friend Joe the Magician asks, between Stannis and Renly, who was the top and who was bottom? The answer, I imagine, is that they would fight about it every single time. And just you can let your imagination play out as to how it would go. I know Jeff's letting his imagination play out right now.
I'm letting my imagination play out by thoughts of prayer and heaven and how great heaven is going to be.
Pray with me, Loris. I fear I've forgotten how.
Stenley is not a thing, guys. It was a flub. It was a word flub, and
it was a Freudian slip, is what it is, buddy, and you can't deny it.
Someone calls it the red pegging, and oh my god, no!
Oh, you people are artists. I love it.
Artists of evil.
Sure. Guilty Undertaker asks a very interesting question. Is Euron the end result of the dying of institutions we saw in this chapter? Yes, this is a crucial part of the argument I'm making in my big Euron essay that I'm currently writing, that George frames Euron as like the child of the war, in a sense, like all the chaos and breakdown and breaking of taboos is rolling out the red carpet for him and enabling his conquest to a certain extent. I think that's part of what makes him a really interesting character. You see that in terms of how he handles himself politically on the Iron Islands. You see that in terms of him invading Old Town, like the center of all knowledge and lore in Westeros, and probably going to burn that down. So I think that's a big part of what makes Euron a more interesting character than I think a lot of people recognize, is that he's like just the metaphorical end result of everything we see in the first three books. All that kind of devastation and loss. He embodies that beautifully. And again, it's going to be years down the road before we get to Euron in the main NotACast. But I think that's part of what makes him effective, and part of why it kind of works for me that he comes in so late, because it feels like it was all building up to him in a way.
I think like Euron also works. It's interesting that Euron appears in the same book in person as the High Sparrow appears there, where you have these two major characters that are showing the rottenness and corruption of the cultures that they're coming from and being like, all right, guys, like here's the drowned god. Here's your stupid version of the drowned god. I'm going to take that. I'm going to exploit the shit out of it and become Euron, destroyer of the worlds, and Euron, bringer of the apocalypse onto Old Town and potentially onto all of Westeros too, with bringing the Horn of Jormungand, bringing the wall down. The High Sparrow works similarly in a similar but different fashion in that he is what happens at the end of the war, but also what happens when you have a weak institution in the faith of the Seven, then being not corrupted, but being reformed, because George has talked about how the High Sparrow was influenced by the Protestant Reformation, where you had a weak Roman Catholic Church in the late 15th century, which then allows for the outbreak of the Protestant Reformation in the early 16th century, and all of the violence that flows out from it. Because the High Sparrow represents the true faith, right? He's he's the guy who's actually bringing the gospel down, like the fire and brimstone, and he's having an effect and impact because people are realizing that this institution is weak and has been all sorts of terrible fucking horror to the peasants and hasn't protected them whatsoever. The High Sparrow comes in and is like, all right, well, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna arm everybody. We're gonna, we're gonna have a standing army run by me and only by me. And that is how we are going to reestablish and reassert ourselves as from this corrupt institution that was there in the years preceding this. And I think it's really great in this chapter too, in Arya 5, that the High Septon here is this fat guy who could barely stand. I think in Clash, he's like carried around in a palanquin, if I'm not mistaken, sort of the same way that Illyrio is in Tyrion's dance chapters. And
they rip him into shreds in the Red Riots, and it's kind of awesome. But yeah, man, you really just got me so excited to talk about Feast for Crows with you, sir, because that's a great comparison of Euron and the High Sparrow. And they even have like these parallel chapters, like Cersei 6 in the Feast for Crows is where she meets the High Sparrow. He's got all his followers in the plaza. And it's really when he's kind of his coming out party as a character. Next chapter is The Reaver, which is all about Euron's rise to power. The Sparrow and the Crow, the two birds of that book, kind of as opposites. Not as opposites, but also a lot of similarities. Like we first meet the High Sparrow in Brienne's first chapter in Feast, when he's coming out of the Riverlands with this wagon full of bones. Like he's bringing all the evidence of this death and war to King's Landing to confront the elites with it. And Euron is similar in that he too comes with all this baggage of the war, but it's not to like make a moral case. It's to get power from it. Like he's framed as like this kind of god of the graveyard figure who's going to take power and draw power from all this death. And those, I think they're the two most like thematically important new characters in the Feast for Crows. Doran and Arianne and the Dornish characters are also really important in terms of character and plot and so forth. But in terms of what George is getting at in that book, I think those are the two big ones. Now, someone asked, who asked if Euron is hot? It was R.J. Morrison who asked if Euron is hot. Yeah, Euron is canonically the hot Greyjoy in his generation. Like as soon as he walks in, Victarion's like, fuck, he's still hot. I waited 2 years for him to get ugly, and he's still so much prettier than me. And it's not just that Euron is attractive in a way that makes Victarion resentful, although that certainly works. It's Euron is good looking in this really weird kind of eerie way where he's like a little too beautiful. Like he's got this perfectly pale skin and shining blue eye. He looks like a White Walker. That's the kind of pretty that Euron is, not like a human being who's pretty. He looks more like the others than he looks like his brothers, if I may unintentionally rhyme. And I think that's one of the many subtle clues George works into A Feast for Crows, that Euron is actually nothing like the rest of his people and has nothing but contempt for them. And his real sights are set much higher, much more in the White Walker, Valyrian Doom kind of world. So he's certainly supposed to be the good looking one, but he's not the kind of person that everyone would like be into like automatically. Because a lot of people look at him and go, something's off. Like technically you look perfect, but there's something weird and inhuman about your beauty. And that's one of the reasons I think he's actually a really well-constructed character. As you may have gathered, I think Euron's interesting.
And you would say that Euron's hot because canonically you are the Euron of the podcast and I'm the Victarion of the NotACast podcast.
Well, I mean, Victarion is basically Stannis if he was a POV. So, and Euron is basically Renly if Renly had superpowers. So that works. That works.
Yeah. We got a question from Cheesecloth who asks, podcast fancast, Euron, Christian Bale or Keanu Reeves? Your call, sir.
Ooh. Here's the thing. Keanu probably looks more like him, but he's just such a sweetheart. that I just kind of love and want to pet, that I would be very anxious and confused. Like if he was playing Euron Greyjoy, like I would just be like, no, buddy, you're not like this. Christian Bale, yeah, I could see that. He's definitely got kind of the face for it. I find it so hard to accept anyone but Mads Mikkelsen.
Yes,
as the Euron fan cast. He was just born to play that role. It's a damn shame that they didn't just back a dump truck full of money up to him to get him to do it. Obviously, it's probably not realistic, but like he has that look, that otherworldly good look, and you see it nailed in something like Hannibal, where it's just like, no, you're handsome, but it's not in a way that makes you not in a way of an attractive human being, more like a disturbing statue brought to life. Something is wrong about you. Mads really has that look and that kind of serene madness in his eyes. I think he could have nailed that role. So there's lots of good fan casts for Euron, I think, but like I always go with Michael Shannon for Stannis, I got to go with Mads for Euron.
And I have to go with Ray Stevenson for Victarion Greyjoy, the guy who played Titus Pullo in Rome, the TV series from the mid-aughts, which is a great show. If you guys have not checked that out, it's only 2 seasons worth, but it's a interesting take on Rome. And it's not bad historically. It's not terrible. It's not like 100% accurate. They do condense a lot of history, but it's really good. And Ray Stevenson plays a fantastic character in that series. And 13, as Frank Baum is saying here in the chat, 13, where he has that fantastic seed there. But yeah, he would be a great Victarion Greyjoy. Pair him up with Mads Mikkelsen as Euron, and you have a fantastic pair of Greyjoy brothers. And wow, how sad it is that we never actually got to see Euron in Game of Thrones, the TV show. And so they never cast him, if I'm not mistaken, right?
It's too bad the show ended in season 4. I don't know why they did that. But yeah, I mean, one of my favorite dialogue scenes in the books is Euron versus Victarion at the Shield Islands in the Reaver, when it's just like these two completely different kinds of villains just talking past each other, and they just can't relate at all. Like Euron offers Victarion the shade of the evening, and he spits it out, which, man, there's a loose thread I would have loved to see followed up on, is Victarion tripping. Because he would just be sitting there like with his arms crossed going, nope, no, I don't like that. Nuh-uh, not my thing. But I love it because, like, Euron's like, oh, our people are ridiculous. I promised them dragons and they want grapes. And Victarion's like, yes, grapes good. Grape in hand. Grape make wine. Folk want grapes. And he's like, what do you want to do, Euron? And Euron's like, I want to create woe. I want to take over the whole world and just turning into this burning sacrifice to my glory. And whoosh, anime hair. And... And it's wonderful because like these two guys were raised together in a family, but they're not even. It's like they're not even having a conversation. They're such different human beings that it's just like Euron's on this just completely different plane, and he's kind of spelling out his whole backstory for Victarion, but Victarion doesn't get it because Victarion's whole thing is not getting it. We're gonna have a lot of fun with the Greyjoys when we get to A Feast for Crows, because I think for me that's the most underrated chunk of the series. Is the Greyjoy stuff, starting in Feast and spreading out into Dance and into the Forsaken. I think all of those Greyjoy brother characters are actually really fascinating and play off each other in really interesting ways. So yeah, a lot of it probably wouldn't have translated to the show, but that specific scene of Euron and Victarion talking at the Shield Islands, I would love to see an adaptation of that.
I love this from the Guilty Undertaker, who says, Victarion on Shade of the Evening, where has taken the Shade of the Evening. I don't understand. Why am I on strings connecting to my brother's face? I'm not a puppet. Yes, you can imagine Victarion saying that.
Victarion is like Drax in the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, where it's like, what's a metaphor? Like, I don't understand. Everything must be very literal and to the point. Right. And that's what makes him so much fun, is you drop this character in the middle of all these magical shenanigans who just has no clue what's happening. And you just get to watch the world through his dumb eyes. And it's so perfect. Like, that's part of what makes Euron so interesting, is that him in Feast and then Mercuro in Dance are both, whenever they talk to Victarion, are just clearly barely keeping themselves from bursting into laughter at how dumb this guy is and how easy it is to manipulate him. Like, I love Mercuro. He's just always smiling when he's talking to Victarion, because clearly he's thinking, I didn't think it would be this easy. Like, I came out of the sea after 10 days, and within 45 seconds, I've taken over this fleet. Wow. And as we'll get into, that's great, because Victarion's mindset gets at a lot of what's wrong with the old way, and how the old way is really vulnerable to Euron. As I will be describing at length in my Euron essay.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. Okay, RJ Morrison asks, if the world is a Westworld simulation, which character would most likely be a visitor? Euron again.
Euron has that kind of Randall Flagg kind of aspect to him, where he feels like he's kind of invading the story itself and like coming in from outside and going, "Oh, Song of Ice and Fire, huh? That looks nice. I think I'll take it for myself." So yeah, that's a good one. Marwyn the Mage kind of feels that way to me. You know, like he's coming out of a different story and is like a little too wise, or maybe wise is the wrong word, but a little too knowledgeable about everything that's happening, and the way he just kind of drifts in and out of people's backstories. That has an interesting aspect to it for sure. A lot of that kind of Euron Old Townish plot has those kind of characters. What do you think, Jeff? Anyone else who feels like they're visiting?
Our favorite character, Quaithe, of course.
Oh, you're right. Oh, that actually makes Quaithe kind of make sense.
It makes her a little compelling, right? Ultimately, because you're like, oh wait, if she's suddenly like our avatar, or like the person coming in from the outside visiting Westworld or Westeros world, and she's like giving all these like cryptic prophecies to Daenerys Targaryen as like kind of like this kind of like, ooh, this would be fun. Let's see how this character interacts when I get this really vague prophecy, and let me enjoy the spectacle of watching Dany devolve into this person who is obsessed with her destiny and prophecy, and all because of this visitor just gave her the
Oh, that's perfect. Quaithe is like a bored heiress who goes to like Westworld just for fun, just to fuck with Dany. That honestly, that would make everything about Quaithe acceptable to me. That's just perfect. All right, what else we got? What else you got for us? You bunch of losers. Oh, Frank Bum, our friend, asks, how pissed must Euron have been to have to obey Balin? It's a different question, maybe a little bit, but one of the reasons, again, I find Euron so interesting, just the theme of the night, is that he doesn't really have a chip on his shoulder. Like a lot of the villains do. Like Ramsay has this whole, Dad didn't need me Bolton. He doesn't respect me. And Joffrey's like, I kind of looked up to Robert, but I never got what I needed. And, you know, Tyrion, if you want to consider him a villain, as many do, and as George does, he's got his whole chip on his shoulder about Tywin. Cersei does, about how she's treated because she's a woman. But Euron has this weird serenity to him, other than when Roderick the Reader calls him out about Valyria, that where he's just like, yeah, I mean, I imagine him, you know, following Balin's orders and just laughing in his head the whole time. Like, you don't even know, man. You don't even know that I killed our brothers and I killed our father. I'm going to kill you next. Like, there's something about his glee that I think makes him partially so terrifying. I don't think Euron would be nearly as interesting if he wasn't surrounded by specifically the Ironborn and these like fucked up Greyjoys and just wonderfully manipulating them. So yeah, I mean, maybe Euron was pissed, but again, Victarion is the Stannis parallel. Victarion is the one with the kind of deep set resentments about his brothers. Euron is the one who's just kind of waltzing his way through life, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think it's Euron is like almost like dispassionate in the way that he's like, oh, just dispatching like brothers and his father and Balon the king. He's like, yeah, I'm a kinslayer. Like, who cares? I mean, I had to bring the apocalypse to the world after all, right? Right, brother? Right? Of like, no, not right. Not right at all. Not right at all. Okay, so Frank B asked another question, or has a statement. Jeff and Emmett, please comment on how all of those cheering for Ned Stark's execution justifies the destruction of the entire city. Signed, Matt Iglesias of Vox.com.
Yeah, if you're following us on Twitter, you might have pointed out that Jeff and I found the middle of our political Venn diagram is hating on Vox and Matty Y. Like, that dude just puts out the most contrary and wrong takes just for the hell of it at this point. He's so fucking bored. And yeah, if you didn't see his article, also the balls it takes to release this article, like defending the destruction of the city on Memorial Day. Like, Jesus, dude. Did no one think that shit through? But I mean, yeah, and it's also a point people have brought up semi-seriously, I guess, on social media, that, like, you know, the people of King's Landing are just kind of terrible and irredeemable because they cheered on Ned's execution. And that's just wrong on so many levels. Like, first of all, guys, you do realize that like 500,000 people live in this city, right? How many of them do you think were in that square that day, realistically? What percentage of people were there? You're going to hold all the rest and their kids and their elderly responsible for that? And like, yeah, of course they were cheering it on because they don't know that Ned Stark's a good guy. They're not reading a Game of Thrones.
Oh, yeah. They
don't have access to these POVs. All they know is that Ned Stark is this traitor who's confessing to them. So of course they're getting riled up about it. That's how the public politics works in this domain. The notion that they need to be punished for that is just like, for me, that's just like the worst possible takeaway from Ned Stark's death. Like, imagine Ned reacting to that idea. He would come back from the dead just to slap anyone making that argument.
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be a very nerdy historical comparison, and religious one too. But it's like the same thing happens with the when Jesus is put forward by Pontius Pilate in the Gospels, and the crowd is like, "Crucify him! Crucify him! Crucify him!" We've been with this is terrible. We've been with Jesus for like numerous chapters in the first book.
Ah,
Oh
ah,
God. Oh, I'm gonna be praying a lot tonight. But we do have that entire, narrative that's there beforehand, but the people there might not have necessarily witnessed all the quote miracles that Jesus performed and stuff like that, and so they're there because it's good sport to have to watch Jesus or Ned be killed and stuff like that. But it's like the, the comparison you can make though too is like, well, they shouldn't have cheered Jesus being killed, or else the Romans and their just desserts was having the Romans sack the city of Jerusalem, some 40 years after the fact. Like, is that the comparison that you're actually making? Is that the moral comparison that you're making, that because they cheered for Ned Stark being executed? I mean, I've not read the full article. I couldn't read the article really. I really just couldn't. I mean,
yeah, no, it's the worst. But yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm not a Christian myself, but I'm pretty sure "Forgive them, Father, they know not what they do" was
right.
part of that whole thing. Like, isn't that So that's just an insane take for sure. So I'm glad he's getting so thoroughly roasted for it back and forth across the internet. I'm sure he's immune to that by now, because dude's been righteously roasted for decades.
Decades now. It's almost 2 decades since I remember reading. Funny personal story. I remember reading him before Vox was even around. I think he wrote for Slate back in like the early 2000s. I want to say.
Yep.
So I first it was like around the same time I was reading like him and like Ezra Klein and a few other folks there from the neoliberal left that or left. Emmett is probably eyes are rolling in the back of his head.
Them. Absolutely not.
But
I'll go on a rant about Ezra Klein some other time. But yes, carry on.
Yeah, I mean, these guys are all grew up in the era of the Iraq War, of 9/11, and I know that Matt Y, whatever he wants to call himself, or whatever they want us to call him, has renounced his support for the Iraq War and stuff like that, but he still has bad takes still all the way around.
Yeah, he's still a little too eager to talk about war power, and just enjoys like doing country and actually Amazon is great takes, and he's just the worst kind of detached pundit who like views politics as just kind of like a horse race that he can sit back and watch and doesn't have actually any skin in the game. Anywho, let's see what else we got in the chat. Past everyone talking about my cats. They're not that interesting, guys. I mean, I love them, but they're cats. They don't have takes. Micah Clark says, question, talk Asha. Well, we're going to have, we're setting a wedding date, me and her. So
no.
We'll let you know about the registry. Okay. Jeff has Ariana as his in-universe girlfriend, and I have Asha.
Yeah, but Asha's my side piece.
Rude. That's the way to talk about your queen, Jeff.
Can that arrangement still last, even if you're going to set a wedding date with Asha? Can she still be my side piece?
What do you think? This took a turn.
It could be an Asha sandwich.
You saw this coming that Jeff was going to sexually freak me out. That is a twist worthy of George R. R. Martin. Jesus fucking Christ.
Oh my gosh.
All right, Keith J asks a fan cast question. If not, Stephen Delane, who plays Stannis in your show version? I mentioned it before. Michael Shannon. Michael Shannon's one of my favorite all-time actors. He commits absolutely to every role. He's the only thing about Man of Steel that I like, and he's just got like those blazing blue eyes and the black hair and that just brittle voice. So just imagining him say, I am not without mercy, or come to me before I will destroy you, Renly, or Edric's very name is a blot upon my soul and a dark roaring in my ears. I can just picture it so perfectly. Obviously, Stephen Delane was one of the best performers on the show. As many people have pointed out, he seems to just kind of be Stannis in his relationship to the show, where he's asked, what did you get out of it? And he was like, paycheck. Do you watch it? No. What did you think it was about? Nothing. What did you think of your character? I don't know. It's like, why are you having this interview? You gave me a chair. Mm-hmm. Like, so that's wonderful. But yeah, I've always pictured Michael Shannon in that role.
Yeah, I think he'd be great. And I mean, if you guys have not seen Boardwalk Empire, the HBO series that ended a few years ago, I want to say, really, really strongly recommend that show. He's in that show as is he a Treasury agent or is he an FBI agent? I can't remember what exactly he is there, but he's just this.
Too long. Yeah, I know. I remember his character though.
In season 1, he writes this letter to his wife. Like the entire letter to his wife is like, take care of the garden and do all of these sorts of things and love whatever the character's name is. So it's very much who Stannis Baratheon is, that there's something like boiling under the surface there, but he's never going to show that, even though like you can see like deep down inside, like he is definitely feeling the things that he's feeling. So
that twitch and that stoniness and the way Davos describes him in Storm is like his bones are like moving around under his skin. Like that's just so 100% Michael Shannon. Tony343 asks, if you could kill Janos Slynt or Littlefinger, who would you choose? Whew. I mean, I'd probably say Littlefinger.
Mm-hmm.
I think his list of crimes is just so long. And like Janos Slynt's the worst, but he has kids. So I guess I don't want them. I guess I would choose them not being orphaned because they didn't do anything wrong. But to the pyre with both of them, frankly. Janos is one of these least sympathetic characters. And one of Stannis' greatest moments is absolutely tearing him to shreds when he gets to the wall and Storm of Swords. And Janos is like talking about, you're a wonderful, strong king. I saw you coming from the wall. You're going to save the day. And Stannis just looks at him and says, shut the fuck up. I remember you from King's Landing, you corrupt piece of shit. I want dead. I still want you dead. I know exactly what you are. The singers may do as they like. And it's just, and he just starts sweating and it's just, mwah. I think that's one of those scenes where even people who don't like Stannis are generally on his side because Janos is such a sycophantic piece of shit. And Stannis doesn't fall for it for a second. It's just delightful.
It is very delightful. And I think it's Littlefinger's the choice there. But I do think that Janos Slynt works as foreshadowing for Littlefinger's eventual demise. There's a great theory by our friends at Radio Westeros, which has it that what is the sword? Again, I'm terrible with the sword names. This the sword that Mira Reed might bring down Bloodraven's sword, Dark Sister. Dark Sister that she might snatch out of Bloodraven's cave, bring down to Winterfell, and that might be what actually brings down Littlefinger itself. Now, whether Sansa will wield the sword herself or whether she'll have someone cut his head off will be just glorious. Okay, so we got an interesting question from Charles Espinoza, who asks, what do you think will happen in the Camera That Rises plot line in The Winds of Winter? So, yes, I mean, Arya Hota is, I actually really like his point of view chapters, but it's not wrong to call him a camera because essentially he operates in similar narrative function as Davos Seaworth in that he was invented to get a point of view of Stannis Baratheon. But as opposed to Davos Seaworth, who has like real moral quandaries and has real dialogue and real exchanges with the person that he's point of viewing, Arya Hota doesn't. And that's
no, but George doesn't try to give him that and fail. It's not like he has a character arc that doesn't work. I think he's actually more interesting than he's given credit for. He's basically the POV of what a white would be like this utter, complete, slavish devotion to duty and to being someone's sidekick. And I think he has this interesting kind of spooky Zen attitude as a result of that. Like at the end of the Queenmaker, after this devastating event in which Aerys Oakheart gets killed and Myrcella is wounded, and Arianne just covered in tears and asks him, who told him? And Arya says, someone told, someone always tells. And it's so wonderful because it's a way of using that camera perspective to make an interesting point. Like, of course, Arya would be the character who has this detached perspective enough to see that it doesn't matter, Arianne, who told. Someone was always going to tell. These master plans that you and your father are so invested in are doomed to fail. And you need kind of a detached perspective to make that work. I also think Arya works as a POV because George wants to catch us up on Dorne so quickly in A Feast for Crows. He doesn't have like a dozen chapters to work with, like in Winterfell at the beginning of book 1. And so you kind of need a POV who's just focused on what's happening and is not bringing a huge amount of drama. Definitely, if you rank POVs in terms of being interesting characters, Arya Hota is near the bottom, but I think he is used very effectively, and I think there's more interesting themes in his character than I give him credit for. But in terms of what he's going to do, he's going off to the Starfall area to hunt for Dark Star along with Oberysant and Balon Swan. I get the impression from his chapter in The Watcher that he's been ordered to kill Balon Swan for his role in setting up Trystane Martell's potential death on the road back to King's Landing. Like he's thinking to himself, so looking at Balon, this one's going to be harder than Aerys. He's going to stand behind his shield and make me come at him. It's like, well, why are you even thinking about that? But why are you assessing Balon Swan for this fight? So I think Duran, off camera, so to speak, gave that order. And so Arya, I think, will be our eyes on Starfall, which does seem to be like a plot cobbled together on the fly to deal with the lack of the 5-year gap as a way of just getting Starfall and the Danes and Dawn and that whole side of the story back into the plot. And so Arya is just a useful POV to have there. A couple of people have said in the chat he's probably going to die as part of that. I think that's possible, but I do think he makes sense as the POV on Duran during Duran's death, or if Duran doesn't die, at least dealing with the impact of that side of the Dornish plot. So I think I imagine he will get at least like one chapter in that regard before he goes. I mean, maybe George contrives to get another POV near Duran, but I do think we need a POV on Duran Martell, at least at some point in the Winds of Winter and A Dream of Spring.
I agree with that. I think Doran Martell is not. I don't think he's going to move up to King's Landing. I don't see that happening in the story. I have this. This can be a little more tinfoil. I don't know if it's tinfoil or not, but I have this idea that Doran Martell is still going to be kind of wavering and dithering about whether he should be backing Arya Martell in her quest to join up with Aegon and join Doran Martell to them. And I do wonder whether the Sand Snakes may play a similar role as we saw in season 6 of bringing Doran Martell down, potentially killing him. I think at Starfall itself, I think we're going to see basically a Mexican standoff where you have 3 different factions of totally emerging there. You got Darkstar, you got Abara Sand, you've got Balon Swan. I think it might start off with, well, we got to kill Darkstar first, then we got to kill Doran Martell. But I kind of have this idea that Obara and Arya might actually fight there, and I think Obara Sand will then get out of there quick, fast, and in a hurry. Whether she goes on to Old Town or goes back to wherever Sunspear or the Water Gardens or whatnot, I think is going to be a interesting turn. So I don't ultimately know what's. I've got a lot of different ideas, and some of them are conflicting about what the end state of Doran Martell's storyline is. Although it will end at the end, the same ending, namely that he will come to rue his desire for vengeance, justice, fire, and blood.
For sure. I think that is the logical conclusion of Duran's story, for sure. But as you say, it's hard to determine because this is, again, clearly a plot that wasn't originally in the plan, it seems like, especially given that Arya doesn't have that much of a foundation to his character. So I think it can go in any number of directions. Do we want to take at least one more, sir?
Yes. Let's. I saw an interesting one up the way. Let me take a look at it. And thank you guys for sticking around with us. It's been a lot of fun chatting with you guys.
It sure has.
If you could gender swap one character, this comes from Joe the Magician. If you could gender swap one character, who would it be? Thank you, hugs and kisses. That's an interesting question.
For sure. I got to think about it for a second. Do you have any ideas off the top of your head, sir? Who's in a position of power or something that could be made more interesting by a gender swap? I
mean, I've always thought it would be interesting, like what people would think if like Rhaenyra and Aegon II were gender swapped. Like if whether you would see people like switch sides, or whether it would be like more of a thing where people are like, well, obviously Rhaenyra has the right of it because she's a he now and he's a dude. You can kind of like flesh out those who are looking at Rhaenyra as a not deserving of the Iron Throne due to her status as a woman, and that it'd be interesting to see those in universe, and also of course those outside of the universe too in the fandom, whether they would kind of switch their position, so to speak, because of her gender being swapped. I don't know. I think I was about to say Stannis. that would be strange. Yeah.
I mean, I guess that would be interesting, but so much of what's wrong with Stannis has to do with his gender and how he looks at gender. So I'm having difficulty imagining. I mean, Stannis has these so many kind of parallel characters, both in the current time frame of the story and in the backstory, but they're all men. So I'm having difficulty. Maybe it would be interesting to see if the Sand Snakes got a different reaction if some of them were men. I don't know if they would, but I mean, some of the Dornish question revolves around gender, so it probably makes some more sense for them to be women, given what a strong theme is in there. What about Mance? That could be interesting. Like the Wildling King Beyond the Wall was also a woman, given that the women in Wildling cultures have a very different relationship to their gender than a lot of Westerosi women. I was going to say that would negate the having a kid situation, but he could be a pregnant warrior Wildling queen, which I think that has potential to be something interesting.
Frank says that you'd be uncomfortable with the female Stannis because you'd be too attracted to her.
Stannis is not sexy. Let me say that now. Having spent several minutes on how sexy Euron is, Stannis is the antithesis of all things sexy. Melisandre is clearly just like checking her watch over his shoulder every time they have sex, and Selyse is a horrible person, really, but I really do feel bad for her in terms of being married to Stannis, because that's just a nightmare.
No, Emmett. Double envelopment of the wildlings at the wall was extremely sexual.
Jeff, we have a talk. We need to review that last sentence. We're getting deep, folks. That's what
yes, we absolutely are.
All right, folks. Well, it is 11:15. Like we said, I do it till now. I guess we should wrap things up here. Thanks again so much for coming to this and watching us talk about this really important chapter and scene, and thanks for sticking around with us afterwards to shit post endlessly. Again, best part of the community possible.
Yeah, it absolutely is, and it's so cool that you guys are sticking around and chatting with us. And obviously, you've been listening to us now for nearly a year and a half. I think we will hit our 18-month mark here next month. I think in our next episode, it's going to be a year and a half until we've been podcasting with you guys. It's awesome. Love you guys so much for all that you do for us and supporting us, not just on Patreon, although we obviously very much appreciate you guys' Patreon support for us. But we appreciate you guys listening to us, supporting us in word and deed. And, it's nice. I know, Emmett, you got to meet a lot of folks who listen to our podcast over at Ice and FireCon. And it's awesome. Thank you guys so much for all you do to make us feel special, happy, and a part of this little community we have here.
For once, Jeff speaks for all of us. So thanks again once more, guys. And this episode is going to be out in our normal podcast audio-only form next week in all the usual places. And as I said at the end of the episode, our next one is going to be Brand 7, covering his kind of reaction at Winterfell, him and Rickon to Ned's death. So check that out. Our Patreon episode this month, covering looking back on Season 8 of Game of Thrones and the show as a whole, is going to be coming out for patrons over the next few days. So if you are a patron or want to sign up, just keep an eye out for that. And we'll have plenty more content coming your way. So take care, guys.
See you soon.